Daddy, she looks like Mommy. The whispered words from 4-year-old June Kane shattered the frozen silence of Bitter Creek Station, stopping her father's heart mid-beat. Samuel Kane, the hardest man in Montana Territory, turned to see what his daughter saw, a bride abandoned in the snow, weeping into a wedding dress that would never know an altar. He didn't know that stopping his wagon that December evening would resurrect ghosts he'd buried, break open wounds he'd sealed shut, or force him to choose between the memory of a dead wife and the possibility of living again. Stay with us until the end of this journey and comment below with your city so we can see how far Eleanor's story travels across the world. The cold came early to Montana Territory in the winter of 1883, descending upon the high plains like divine punishment. By mid-December, the snow had piled so deep along the railroad tracks that the trains ran hours behind schedule, their whistles screaming through the crystalline air like the cries of wounded animals. The few travelers brave or desperate enough to venture into this frozen wilderness huddled in station houses, clutching lukewarm coffee and praying for deliverance. Eleanor Whitfield was neither brave nor desperate. She was simply alone. She stood on the platform at Bitter Creek Station as the afternoon train pulled away, its black smoke dissolving into the pewter sky. Her wedding dress, ivory silk with pearl buttons she'd sewn on by candlelight over 3 months, had turned gray with coal dust and damp. The hem, once pristine, dragged through the slush, collecting ice that clinked softly with each small movement. Her veil, torn free somewhere between Virginia and this godforsaken outpost, lay crumpled in her carpet bag along with everything else she owned: 2 extra dresses, a hairbrush missing half its bristles, a Bible her mother had given her, and a daguerreotype of her parents standing stiff and unsmiling before their Richmond parlor. Also in that bag, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was a lavender-scented handkerchief embroidered with the initials H.B., Henry Braddock, the man who had promised her forever, the man who had married someone else 4 days ago. Eleanor's hands, elegant despite the chilblains reddening her knuckles, clutched the handle of her carpet bag as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to smoke. Her lips moved in silent repetition of the letter she'd received just this morning, delivered by the station master with an apologetic grimace. My dearest Eleanor, I must inform you with deep regret that circumstances have changed. Miss Catherine Wardwell and I were united in matrimony on the 15th instant. Her father's position and connections make this union advantageous for my future prospects. I trust you will understand that sentiment, however genuine, must sometimes yield to practicality. I have arranged for your return passage to Virginia. The ticket awaits you at Bitter Creek Station. Yours in remembrance, Henry Braddock. Practicality. That single word had erased 6 months of letters, a year of courtship, 3 months of planning. Eleanor had sold her mother's silver tea service to afford the train fare west. She'd endured the suspicious glances of fellow passengers who'd noted her traveling alone, unchaperoned. She'd stitched this wedding dress in the cramped cabin of a lurching rail car, pricking her fingers bloody as the train swayed through the Dakotas. And Henry Braddock had married someone else. The return ticket lay in Eleanor's other hand now, a flimsy piece of paper that represented everything she'd lost. But when she looked at it, she felt nothing. No relief, no gratitude for Henry's thoughtfulness, nothing but a hollow ache that had settled into her chest somewhere around the Nebraska border and hadn't left. The afternoon was dying. Bitter Creek Station was little more than a weathered platform, a ticket office, and a storage shed. Beyond it stretched Montana's winter landscape, endless white interrupted only by dark clusters of pine and the occasional barn or fence line. The mountains rose in the distance like frozen waves, their peaks lost in the heavy clouds that promised more snow. This was beautiful country, Eleanor thought distantly, beautiful and merciless. Miss, you all right? Eleanor turned. The station master, a grizzled man named Perkins with tobacco-stained whiskers, stood in the doorway of the ticket office. His expression held the uncomfortable pity of a man unaccustomed to dealing with weeping women. The eastbound don't come through again until tomorrow morning, he said. There's a boarding house in town about 2 miles east. Mrs. Henderson. She's decent, won't charge you much. Eleanor nodded mechanically. Thank you. But she didn't move. Couldn't move. The thought of walking 2 miles through the snow, of explaining herself to some stern-faced boarding house keeper, of spending the night in a strange bed knowing that tomorrow she'd begin the long journey back to Virginia and the wreckage of her life. It was too much. Far too much. So she simply stood there as the station master retreated, muttering about "damn fool women," and the shadows lengthened across the snow. She wasn't aware she was crying until the tears began to freeze on her cheeks. Eleanor lifted one hand to wipe them away and found that her fingers wouldn't obey properly. The cold had worked its way deep into her bones, making her movements clumsy and slow. Her feet, inadequately protected by delicate shoes meant for a wedding dance rather than a Montana winter, had gone numb an hour ago. She should go inside, find shelter, do something. But what was the point? The question arrived with such stark clarity that Eleanor actually swayed on her feet. What was the point of any of it? She was 23 years old, unmarried, unchaperoned, penniless. Her reputation, such as it was, had been shredded the moment she'd boarded that westbound train alone. Her family, a distant aunt in Richmond who'd grudgingly taken Eleanor in after her parents died, had made it clear that there would be no welcome waiting for her if she returned as damaged goods. "You made your bed," Aunt Letitia had written in her last letter. "Now lie in it." Eleanor looked down at her wedding dress, at the careful stitches and delicate lace she'd chosen with such hope. She'd imagined Henry removing this dress on their wedding night, imagined his hands gentle and reverent as he unlaced the buttons. Instead, the dress would be her burial shroud, metaphorically, if not literally. She would pack it away, never to be worn, a monument to her own foolishness. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine smoke from distant chimneys. Somewhere in this frozen wilderness, families were gathering around dinner tables. Children were being tucked into warm beds. Men were kissing their wives goodnight. The ordinary magic of ordinary lives, unfolding in countless small ways. Eleanor would never have that now. The thought arrived with such finality that it drove the last warmth from her body. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the crunch of wheels on packed snow, the steady clop of hoofbeats. Eleanor didn't look up. What did it matter? Another traveler passing through, indifferent to the broken woman in the ruined wedding dress. But then the wagon stopped. Eleanor lifted her head slowly, her neck stiff with cold. Through the veil of her tears and the gathering dusk, she saw a man sitting atop a rough-hewn wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He was perhaps 35, though the harshness of his life made exact age difficult to determine. His face was all hard planes and sharp angles, weathered by sun and wind until it looked carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. Dark hair, touched with premature gray at the temples. Dark eyes that held no warmth, but also no cruelty, merely a profound, bone-deep weariness. Beside him sat a small child bundled in so many layers of wool and fur that only her face was visible. A heart-shaped face with enormous blue eyes and dark curls escaping from beneath a knitted cap. The child couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. The man stared at Eleanor for a long moment, his jaw working as though chewing over some internal debate. Then the little girl tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy?" she whispered, but her voice carried clearly in the cold air. "She looks like Mommy." The man flinched as though he'd been struck. His hands tightened on the reins, and for a moment Eleanor thought he would drive on, leave her there to freeze. Perhaps that would be best. Perhaps that was what she deserved. But then the man wrapped the reins around the brake lever and climbed down from the wagon with stiff, reluctant movements. He approached Eleanor slowly, his boots crunching through the snow, stopping a respectful distance away. "You all right, miss?" His voice was low and rough, like gravel being dragged over wood. Eleanor tried to speak, but her throat had closed. She managed only a small shake of her head. The man's eyes, dark brown she saw now, almost black, moved from her face to the wedding dress and back again. Understanding dawned, followed by something that might have been sympathy in a man capable of such feeling. "You waiting for someone?" This time Eleanor found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "No, no one's coming." The man absorbed this information with a slight nod. He glanced back at his wagon, where the little girl watched with wide, solemn eyes, then back at Eleanor. "There's a boarding house." "I know," Eleanor interrupted. The station master told me. But you're not going. It wasn't a question, so Eleanor didn't answer. She simply looked at this stranger, this hard, worn man who'd stopped for reasons she couldn't fathom, and felt the last of her composure crumble. I don't have anywhere to go, she heard herself say. The admission, once spoken, seemed to strip away every last defense she'd built during the long journey west. I came here to be married. The man I was supposed to marry, he married someone else 4 days ago, and I don't. Her voice broke completely. She turned away, mortified by her own weakness, pressing her frozen hands against her face as though she could physically hold back the tears. She heard the man take a step closer, then stop. When he spoke again, his voice had softened almost imperceptibly. What's your name? Eleanor Whitfield. Miss Whitfield. He paused, and she heard him draw a breath. My name is Samuel Kane. That's my daughter, June. We have a ranch about an hour's ride from here. Another pause, longer this time. I'm going to put my coat around your shoulders now. Don't be afraid. Eleanor felt heavy wool settle over her shoulders, still warm from his body. The coat smelled of wood smoke and horses and honest work. She turned back to find Samuel Kane standing in his shirt sleeves, seemingly impervious to the cold that was killing her degree by degree. I can't take your coat, she protested weakly. You'll freeze. I'm used to it. His expression hadn't changed, still that same impassive mask, but his eyes held something new. Not kindness, exactly. Perhaps recognition. One broken thing acknowledging another. You're not. Mr. Kane, No one should be left in the cold, he said quietly. It sounded like something he'd been told once, long ago, and was now passing on. There's a fire at my place, hot food, a bed if you need one. He glanced back at June, who was leaning forward in the wagon, her small face bright with interest. The child won't stop asking about you. She thinks... He stopped abruptly, jaw clenching. She thinks you look like someone we lost. Eleanor's breath caught. She looked past Samuel to the little girl, who waved tentatively, and suddenly understood. The wedding dress. The dark hair. Whatever resemblance June saw, it was causing this man pain. I should go to the boarding house, Eleanor said, but even as she spoke, she knew it was a lie. She had no strength left for walking, no strength left for anything but surrender. Samuel must have heard the capitulation in her voice, because he simply nodded and held out his arm. Wagon's warmer than it looks. June will talk your ear off if you let her, but she means well. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before taking his arm. His strength, transmitted through that simple contact, was shocking. This man was solid in a way nothing else in her life had been for months, perhaps years. He guided her through the snow to the wagon as though she weighed nothing at all. June beamed as Eleanor climbed up beside her. I'm June Elizabeth Kane, the child announced with grave formality. I'm 4 3/4. Are you really a bride? June. Samuel's voice held a warning note as he climbed up and took the reins. Let the lady be. It's all right, Eleanor said softly. She managed a small smile for the child, though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. Yes, I was going to be a bride, but things changed. June processed this with the solemn consideration only small children can achieve. That's sad. I'm sorry things changed. Thank you, June. Samuel clicked his tongue and the horses moved forward, pulling the wagon away from Bitter Creek Station and into the gathering darkness. Eleanor didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. They rode in silence for the first few minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Eleanor pulled Samuel's coat tighter around her shoulders, grateful for its warmth but aware of the awkwardness of the situation. This man, this stranger, had stopped for her when he had no obligation to do so. Why? She studied him from beneath her lashes. Samuel Kane's profile was stern, his attention fixed on the road ahead. His jaw was shadowed with several days' worth of beard. His hands on the reins were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them every day. There was no softness about him anywhere, not in his face, not in his bearing, not in the rigid set of his shoulders. Yet he'd given her his coat. Mr. Kane, Eleanor began. Samuel, he corrected without looking at her. Out here, we don't stand much on formality. Samuel. The name felt strange in her mouth. I appreciate your kindness, but I don't want to impose. If you could take me to the boarding house in town, I can... Town's in the opposite direction, he interrupted. And it's coming on dark. Storm's rolling in. He finally glanced at her, his expression unreadable. You'll stay the night at the ranch. Tomorrow, if you want to go to town, I'll take you. But tonight, you need to get warm and get some food in you, or you won't make it to tomorrow. It wasn't a request. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. He was right, of course. She could feel hypothermia's seductive whisper, urging her to simply close her eyes and sleep. If she'd stayed at that station much longer. Thank you, she said instead. Samuel acknowledged this with a slight nod and said nothing more. June, however, had no such reservations about conversation. Do you like horses? She asked Eleanor, bouncing slightly on the wooden seat. We have 6 horses. Well, 5 now because Rosie died last month. Daddy says animals die sometimes and we shouldn't be sad, but I'm still a little sad. Is that okay? June, Samuel said again, but with more resignation than irritation. It's perfectly okay to be sad, Eleanor told the child gently. Sadness means we loved something. That's nothing to be ashamed of. June's face brightened. That's what Mama used to say. Daddy says I shouldn't talk about Mama, but I still remember her. She had dark hair like you, and she smelled like bread, and she sang songs. The child's voice dropped to a whisper as though sharing a secret. I don't think Daddy wants to remember. Eleanor's heart clenched. She looked at Samuel, but his expression had gone even harder, if that were possible. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. June, he said, and this time his voice carried a warning that even the child recognized. That's enough. June subsided, but she slipped her small hand into Eleanor's and squeezed. Eleanor squeezed back, fighting the sudden burning in her throat. This little girl, who'd lost her mother, was trying to comfort her. The absurdity of it, the terrible, beautiful absurdity, nearly undid her completely. They drove on as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The temperature dropped further, and Eleanor felt the cold working its way through Samuel's coat into her bones. Beside her, June had begun to drowse, her head drooping against Eleanor's arm. How long ago? Eleanor asked quietly. Your wife. Samuel was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, 2 years, almost 2 years exactly. I'm sorry. So is everyone. His tone made it clear the subject was closed. Eleanor fell silent, watching the landscape roll past. They'd left the main road now, following what appeared to be little more than twin ruts through the snow. Fences began to appear. Split rail, weathered gray, and then a barn loomed out of the darkness, its shape solid and reassuring. Beyond it, she could make out the dark outline of a house. Samuel pulled the wagon up to the barn and set the brake. I need to see to the horses. You take June inside, doors unlocked, get the fire built up, and put water on to heat. There's coffee in the tin by the stove. He climbed down and came around to Eleanor's side, lifting June down first. The child woke enough to stand, swaying sleepily. Then Samuel reached up for Eleanor. His hands closed around her waist, and for a moment their faces were level. This close, Eleanor could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the exhaustion that lived in every plane of his face. He lifted her down as easily as he'd lifted his daughter, setting her gently on her feet. House is warm, he said. June will show you where things are. Then he turned away, leading the horses toward the barn, and Eleanor was left standing in the snow with a 4-year-old child and a debt she had no idea how to repay. Come on, June said, taking Eleanor's hand. Daddy keeps the house nice. Well, mostly nice. Sometimes there are dishes. The house was small but well built, constructed from logs chinked tight against the wind. June pushed open the door and pulled Eleanor inside, into a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once. A fireplace dominated one wall, coals still glowing in the grate. A table, 2 chairs, and a small chair that must be June's. Shelves lined with books and household goods. A rocking chair near the fire. Everything was clean but spare, functional rather than comfortable. "The fire's almost out," June announced. "Daddy will be mad if we let it die. He says a dead fire means a cold night." Eleanor moved automatically, grateful for the simple task. She found wood stacked neatly beside the fireplace and began feeding pieces to the coals, blowing gently until flames caught and began to spread. The warmth on her face was almost painful after so much cold. June had shed her outer layers and was now dragging a kettle to the hand pump by the dry sink. "I can't reach," she announced. "You have to pump." Eleanor filled the kettle and set it over the fire to heat, then searched until she found the coffee tin Samuel had mentioned. Her hands, slowly coming back to life, tingled painfully as she scooped grounds into a battered pot. "Are you going to stay?" June asked. She'd climbed into the rocking chair and was swinging her legs, watching Eleanor with those enormous blue eyes. "I hope you stay. It's lonely here, just me and Daddy doesn't talk much. Mama used to talk all the time. She used to sing. Do you sing?" "Sometimes," Eleanor said. "Not very well." "That's okay. Mama wasn't very good either, but Daddy says he loved it anyway." June's expression grew wistful. "I don't remember her voice anymore. I remember other things, but not her voice. Do you think that's bad?" Eleanor's throat tightened. She abandoned the coffee and knelt beside the rocking chair, taking June's small hands in hers. "No, sweetheart. Memory is a strange thing. Sometimes it keeps what we need and lets go of what we don't. Maybe you don't need to remember her voice because you remember other things, more important things." "Like what?" "Like how she made you feel. Safe, I imagine. Loved. Those feelings don't need words." June considered this gravely, then nodded. "You're smart. I like you." "I like you too, June." The door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and Samuel Kane, his hair now dusted with snow. He stamped his boots on the threshold and pushed the door closed, then stopped, his dark eyes moving from Eleanor kneeling by the chair to June's happy face to the fire crackling merrily in the hearth. Something flickered across his expression, too quick for Eleanor to identify, before the mask descended again. "Water hot yet?" he asked. "Getting there," Eleanor said, rising. "I made coffee. I hope that's all right." "It's fine." He crossed to a small doorway Eleanor hadn't noticed before. A bedroom, she realized, catching a glimpse of a neatly made bed before Samuel pulled off his outer coat and hung it on a peg. When he emerged, he'd rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle. "I'll make supper. You should get out of that dress. It's soaked through." Eleanor looked down at herself and realized he was right. The hem of her wedding dress was sodden, the fabric clinging damply to her legs. She must be dripping all over his clean floor. "I don't have... That is, I have another dress, but it's in my bag, and I left my bag at the station." "I brought it," Samuel interrupted. He gestured to the corner where her carpetbag now sat. "Perkins handed it to me before we left. Said you'd be wanting it." Eleanor stared at the bag, then at Samuel. He'd thought to retrieve her belongings. This hard, silent man who seemed to resent her very presence had nonetheless made sure she had what she needed. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel shrugged and turned away, busying himself with a cast-iron skillet. "June, show Miss Whitfield where she can change. Give her some privacy." June hopped down from the chair and took Eleanor's hand. "This way. You can use my room. Well, it's kind of Daddy's room too, but there's a screen." She led Eleanor through another door into a smaller room containing a large bed, a child's cot, and a folding screen in the corner. "Daddy sleeps there," June said, pointing to the bed. "I sleep there. Mama used to sleep with Daddy, but now she's gone, so I sleep with him when I have bad dreams. Is that okay?" "That's perfectly okay," Eleanor assured her. She retrieved her carpetbag and stepped behind the screen, grateful for even the illusion of privacy. Getting out of the wedding dress proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. Her fingers, still clumsy with cold and emotion, fumbled with the pearl buttons. Several popped free and rolled away into the darkness before she finally managed to peel the sodden fabric from her body. Beneath it, her chemise and petticoats were damp with sweat and snowmelt. She stripped everything off, shivering violently, and pulled on the only other decent dress she owned, a simple gray wool with a high neck and long sleeves. Practical, plain, nothing like the wedding dress, which now lay in a crumpled heap at her feet like the corpse of her hopes. Eleanor emerged from behind the screen to find June waiting patiently, swinging her legs from where she sat on the edge of the big bed. "You look different," the child observed, "but still pretty. Daddy will think so too." "I doubt your daddy thinks much about whether I'm pretty or not," Eleanor said gently. June giggled. "Daddy thinks about lots of things. He just doesn't say them out loud." They returned to the main room, where Samuel had produced bread, butter, and what looked like venison stew from somewhere. The coffee was boiling, filling the air with its bitter, welcome scent. He glanced up as they entered, his gaze moving briefly over Eleanor's changed appearance before returning to his cooking. "Sit," he said. "Food's almost ready." Eleanor sat at the table, and June immediately climbed into her lap as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Samuel noticed, but said nothing, simply ladled stew into 3 bowls and set them on the table along with thick slices of bread. They ate in silence. Or rather, Samuel and Eleanor ate in silence while June chattered about everything and nothing. The chickens who weren't laying properly, the fox she'd seen last week, the story her daddy had read her before bed last night. Samuel's responses were monosyllabic at best, but June seemed unfazed by his reticence. The food was simple but good, and Eleanor ate more than she'd thought possible. Warmth was spreading through her body, driving out the terrible cold that had settled into her bones. She was alive. Against all odds and her own dark thoughts, she was alive and sitting in a warm house eating hot food with a strange man and his daughter. It was such a small thing, and yet, in that moment, it felt like salvation. After supper, Samuel cleared the dishes while Eleanor helped June into her nightclothes. The child's bedtime routine was clearly established: face washing, tooth cleaning with a frayed brush, prayers by the bedside. Eleanor found herself following along, holding June's hands while the little girl recited a simple prayer asking God to bless Daddy, the horses, the chickens, and the pretty lady who looks like Mama. Samuel, standing in the doorway, turned away at that last part. June climbed into her cot, and Eleanor tucked the quilts around her small form. "Will you still be here in the morning?" the child asked, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "I don't know, sweetheart." "I hope you stay," June murmured. "I hope you stay forever." By the time Eleanor returned to the main room, June was asleep. Samuel stood by the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel, staring into the flames. He didn't turn when Eleanor entered. "She's asleep," Eleanor said quietly. Samuel nodded but didn't speak. Eleanor stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, uncertain what to do or say. She should thank him again, should explain herself, should apologize for the imposition, should do something. "Mr. Kane, Samuel, I want you to know." "You can take the bed," he interrupted, still not looking at her. "I'll sleep in the chair." "I can't take your bed. I'll sleep in the chair." "You'll take the bed." Now he did turn, and his expression was harder than she'd yet seen it. "I'm not arguing about this, Miss Whitfield. You've had a bad day. You need rest. The bed is yours for tonight." Eleanor's pride flared. "I won't be ordered about like a child." "Then don't act like one." Samuel crossed his arms, his jaw set. "You're exhausted. You're heartbroken. You're in no condition to be stubborn. So you'll take the bed, and in the morning, if you still want to go to town, I'll drive you there myself. But tonight, you're going to accept help whether you like it or not." They stared at each other across the small room, wills clashing in the firelight. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to assert what little independence she had left, but the truth was, she had no fight left in her. And his eyes, for all their hardness, held something she couldn't quite name, a desperation almost. As though he needed to do this thing, this small kindness, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." Samuel's shoulders relaxed slightly. He nodded toward the bedroom. "There's extra quilts in the chest if you get cold." Eleanor retreated to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. She could hear Samuel moving around in the main room, banking the fire, settling into the rocking chair with the creak of wood and rope. She changed quickly into her nightgown, then crawled beneath the quilts on the big bed. The bed smelled of soap and wood smoke, and faintly, of lavender. The quilts were heavy and warm, clearly made by loving hands. Eleanor lay in the darkness, listening to June's soft breathing from the cot nearby, and felt tears sliding down her temples into her hair. She'd been so certain, standing on that platform, that her life was over, that there was nothing left for her but slow decay and eventual death, either literal or metaphorical. She'd been ready to surrender to that cold, to simply stop fighting, but Samuel Kane had stopped his wagon. He'd given her his coat. He'd brought her to this place of warmth and safety, and asked for nothing in return. Why? The question circled through her mind as exhaustion finally pulled her under. Why would a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with her stop? Why would he feed her, shelter her, give up his own bed for her comfort? In the main room, Samuel Kane sat in his dead wife's rocking chair and asked himself the same question. When he'd seen Eleanor Whitfield standing on that platform in her ruined wedding dress, he'd felt his heart stop. June was right. She did look like Mara. Not exactly, but enough. The same dark hair, the same delicate bone structure, the same quiet desperation in her eyes that Mara had worn in those last terrible months before June's birth, when she'd known, somehow, that she wouldn't survive. He should have driven past, should have hardened his heart and left her there. He'd spent 2 years building walls around himself, brick by careful brick, and in one moment that woman had threatened to bring them all crashing down. But June had whispered, "She looks like Mommy," and Samuel had heard Mara's voice in his daughter's words. Mara, who had made him promise in those final pain-racked hours that he would never let bitterness destroy his capacity for kindness. "Don't let this break you," she'd whispered, her hand in his, her life bleeding away. "Promise me, Samuel, promise me you'll stay human." He'd promised. And then he'd spent 2 years proving himself a liar. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he'd honored that promise. He'd stopped for a stranger. He'd offered shelter. He'd looked at a woman broken by love's cruelty and seen, perhaps, a reflection of his own breaking. Tomorrow, he told himself, Eleanor Whitfield would go to town. She'd find that boarding house, or take the train east, or do whatever it was abandoned brides did. She would leave, and his life would return to its quiet, manageable grief. Tomorrow. But for tonight, there was a woman sleeping in his bed who looked like his dead wife, and a little girl who'd smiled more in the past 3 hours than she had in the past 3 months, and Samuel Kane sat in the darkness and wondered what he'd done. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows. The fire crackled. June dreamed of mothers and songs. Eleanor dreamed of trains that never arrived. And Samuel didn't dream at all, just sat and kept watch over these 2 broken souls fate had delivered to his door, wondering if kindness was a gift or just another form of cruelty in disguise. The long Montana night stretched ahead, and dawn seemed very far away. Dawn broke over the Montana plains like a reluctant confession, gray light seeping through the frost-covered windows of Samuel Kane's ranch house. Eleanor woke to the sound of wood being split somewhere outside, the rhythmic thwack of an axe biting into timber. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory returned in a cold rush. The station, the snow, the wedding dress, the stranger who'd stopped his wagon. She sat up slowly, her body aching from cold and exhaustion. Beside her cot, June still slept, one small hand curled beneath her cheek. The child looked peaceful, innocent, utterly unaware of the complicated grief she lived inside. Eleanor watched her for a long moment, feeling something shift in her chest, a protective instinct she had no right to feel for a child she'd known less than 12 hours. The bedroom was simple, but not without comfort. Someone, Mara, Eleanor assumed, had hung curtains at the window, pale yellow fabric now faded with time and sun. A watercolor painting hung on one wall, amateurish but earnest, depicting wildflowers in a mason jar, personal touches in a hard land, small assertions that beauty mattered even when survival consumed everything else. Eleanor rose and dressed quickly in the gray wool, braiding her hair with practiced efficiency. Through the window, she could see Samuel in the yard, splitting wood with mechanical precision. He'd removed his coat despite the cold, and she could see the flex of his shoulders beneath his shirt with each swing of the axe. There was something almost violent in the way he worked, as though he were attacking the wood rather than simply splitting it. She turned away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of watching him unobserved, and moved quietly to the main room. The fire had been rebuilt. Samuel must have risen before dawn, and coffee sat warming on the stove. Eleanor poured herself a cup and stood by the window, watching the sun climb higher over the distant mountains. What was she supposed to do now? She had the return ticket to Virginia, but the thought of going back made her stomach clench with dread. Going back meant admitting defeat, meant enduring Aunt Letitia's bitter satisfaction, meant becoming one of those women who lived on the edges of other people's lives, tolerated but never truly wanted. A cautionary tale whispered about at ladies' socials. But staying meant what, exactly? She had no prospects here, no connections, no means of supporting herself. Last night's shelter had been charity, pure and simple, and Eleanor Whitfield had too much pride to live on charity indefinitely. The door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air, and Samuel Kane, his arms full of split wood. He nodded curtly at Eleanor, good morning compressed into a gesture, and began stacking the wood beside the fireplace. His shirt was damp with sweat despite the freezing temperature, his dark hair falling across his forehead. "You're up," he said without looking at her. Statement, not greeting. "I didn't want to impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." Samuel straightened, brushing bark from his hands. His eyes met hers briefly, unreadable. "Coffee's hot. There's oatmeal in the pot if you're hungry." "Thank you, but I should eat something." He moved past her to the stove, ladling oatmeal into a bowl with the same efficient economy he brought to everything else. "It's a long ride to town. You'll need your strength." So he was taking her to town. Of course he was. What had she expected? That he'd invite her to stay? That one night of charity would somehow transform into something more? Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed by her own foolishness. "I appreciate everything you've done," she said stiffly. "I'll repay you somehow, when I'm able." Samuel set the bowl on the table and finally looked at her directly. "I don't want payment. I want you to eat breakfast before you faint from hunger." They stared at each other across the small room, tension crackling between them like static. Eleanor couldn't understand this man. His words were brusque to the point of rudeness, but his actions suggested something else entirely, a careful attention to her needs that contradicted his apparent desire to be rid of her. The bedroom door opened, saving them both from whatever might have been said next. June emerged, her dark hair a wild tangle, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She stopped when she saw Eleanor, and her face split into a brilliant smile. "You're still here. I thought you might be a dream." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm still here, sweetheart." June ran to her, wrapping small arms around Eleanor's waist with unselfconscious affection. "Are you staying? Please say you're staying." "Daddy, can she stay?" "Miss Whitfield has her own plans," Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. "She's going into town today." June's face fell. She looked up at Eleanor with those enormous blue eyes now swimming with tears. "But why? Don't you like us?" "Oh, June." Eleanor knelt, taking the child's hands. "I like you very much, but I can't just stay here. Your father was kind enough to help me last night, but I have to figure out what to do with my life now. Do you understand?" "No," June said flatly. "Daddy, tell her she can stay." Samuel's jaw clenched. "June, that's enough." "But Daddy..." "I said enough." His tone brooked no argument, and June subsided, lower lip trembling. Samuel ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted. "Go get dressed. We're going into town after breakfast." June fled to the bedroom, and Eleanor stood slowly, feeling like she'd somehow caused damage without meaning to. Samuel had turned away, staring out the window with his shoulders rigid. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quietly. "I shouldn't have..." "She gets attached too easily." Samuel's voice was rough. "Lost her mother. Wants to fill that hole with anyone who shows her kindness. It's not your fault." "Still, I didn't mean to upset her." Samuel glanced at her, something flickering in his dark eyes. "You didn't. I did. I'm the one who stopped yesterday. I'm the one who brought you here." He turned away again. "Should have kept driving." The words stung more than they should have. Eleanor lifted her chin. "Then why didn't you?" "Because I'm a damned fool." He said it so quietly she almost didn't hear. Then he was moving again, collecting dishes, wiping down the table, keeping his hands busy to avoid looking at her. Eleanor stood frozen, unsure whether to be offended or hurt or something else entirely. June returned, dressed but sullen, her hair still unbrushed. She climbed into her chair without looking at anyone and picked at her oatmeal in silence. The meal was tense and uncomfortable, each of them locked in their own thoughts. When Samuel finally pushed back from the table and announced it was time to go, Eleanor felt almost relieved. She gathered her carpet bag and donned her traveling cloak while Samuel hitched the horses to the wagon. June sat on the steps, arms crossed, radiating wounded dignity. Eleanor sat beside her, desperate to mend what she'd broken. "I'm sorry, June. I wish things were different." June didn't answer for a long moment. Then, in a small voice, "Mama went away too. Everybody goes away." Eleanor's heart broke. She pulled the child into her arms, and June clung to her, small body shaking with silent tears. "Sometimes people have to go, sweetheart. But it doesn't mean they don't care. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong." "Then why does it hurt?" "Because you have a big heart, and big hearts feel things deeply." Eleanor smoothed June's wild hair. "That's not a bad thing, even when it hurts." Samuel appeared around the corner of the house, leading the harnessed horses. He stopped when he saw them, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Then he cleared his throat. "Wagon's ready." The ride into town was as silent as the ride from the station had been, but this silence felt different, heavier, laden with things unsaid. June sat between them, pressed against Eleanor's side, holding her hand as though afraid she might disappear. Samuel kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set, speaking only to the horses. Bitter Creek wasn't much of a town, a single street with a dozen buildings, most of them weathered gray by wind and snow. There was a general store, a saloon, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple, and the boarding house Samuel had mentioned, a two-story structure that had once been painted white but now bore the scars of too many hard winters. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the boarding house. For a moment, none of them moved. Then June's grip on Eleanor's hand tightened almost painfully. "Please don't go," the child whispered. Eleanor looked at Samuel, hoping for, what? Permission? Invitation? Some sign that this wasn't the end? But his face was closed, unreadable. "I have to, sweetheart," Eleanor said gently. She climbed down from the wagon, forcing herself to move, to do the practical thing even as everything in her screamed to stay. Samuel handed down her carpet bag. Their hands touched briefly, and Eleanor felt something pass between them, a current of recognition, of shared pain, of possibility. But then he pulled away, and the moment was gone. "Mrs. Henderson is decent," he said gruffly. "Tell her I sent you. She'll treat you fair." "Thank you, Samuel, for everything." He nodded once, then looked away. June had buried her face in her father's side, her shoulders shaking. Samuel's hand came up to rest on her hair, his own expression cracking slightly. Eleanor turned and walked toward the boarding house before her courage failed completely. She'd made it halfway up the steps when she heard June cry out, "Wait!" Eleanor turned. June had jumped from the wagon and was running toward her, clutching something in her hand. The child reached her and thrust forward a small object, a hair ribbon, faded pink, clearly precious. "This was Mama's," June said breathlessly. "I want you to have it, so you remember us." Eleanor's vision blurred. She knelt, taking the ribbon with trembling hands. "June, I can't take this. It's too precious." "That's why I'm giving it to you." June's chin jutted out stubbornly, so like her father's. "Because you're precious too." Eleanor pulled the child into a fierce embrace, no longer caring who saw or what they thought. When she pulled back, she tied the ribbon carefully around her wrist like a bracelet. "I'll treasure it always," she whispered. "Thank you, June." Samuel had climbed down from the wagon and now stood a few feet away, his expression tortured. "June, come on. Let Miss Whitfield go." But June stood her ground. "Daddy, we can't just leave her here." "Yes, we can. We have to." Samuel's voice was strained. "Miss Whitfield has her own life to live." "What life?" June demanded with the brutal honesty of children. "She doesn't have anywhere to go. She said so. And we have room. We have the whole house. She can stay in Mama's—" She stopped, eyes widening as she realized what she'd been about to say. Samuel flinched as though struck. The silence that followed was excruciating. Eleanor forced herself to speak. Your father is right, June. I can't impose any further, but I promise I'll visit if I can, and I'll never forget your kindness. She turned and walked up the steps, each one feeling like a small death. She raised her hand to knock on the boarding house door, her heart hammering, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. The door opened before her knuckles could connect. A woman stood there, 50s, gray-haired, with a kind face weathered by prairie winds. Mrs. Henderson, presumably. Help you, dear? Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Behind her, she heard the wagon creak as Samuel prepared to leave. This was it. This was the moment she'd begin whatever came next. I need a room, she finally managed. Samuel Kane said you might have one available. Mrs. Henderson's eyes sharpened with interest. Samuel Kane sent you, did he? She looked past Eleanor to where Samuel sat frozen in the wagon, June clutched against his side. Interesting. Please, Eleanor said quietly. I can pay. I have some money saved and I can work if you need help with. How long you planning to stay? The question stopped Eleanor cold. How long? A night? A week? Forever? She had no answer. I don't know, she admitted. Mrs. Henderson studied her for a long moment, taking in the gray dress, the carpet bag, the wedding ring notably absent from her left hand. Then she glanced again at Samuel, and something like understanding crossed her face. Tell you what, the older woman said. Why don't you come inside, have some tea, and we'll sort this out. You look like you've had a rough go of it. Eleanor nodded gratefully and followed Mrs. Henderson inside. She didn't look back at Samuel and June. Couldn't. If she looked back, she'd run back to that wagon and beg them to take her with them, and she had too much pride for that. The boarding house was warm and smelled of bread and lye soap. Mrs. Henderson led Eleanor to a small sitting room and bustled off to make tea, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and a view of the street through lace curtains. Through those curtains, she watched Samuel's wagon. He still hadn't moved. June was talking animatedly, gesturing back toward the boarding house. Samuel shook his head, his expression firm. June's shoulders slumped in defeat. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, Samuel wrapped the reins around the brake and climbed down from the wagon. He stood in the street, staring at the boarding house, running a hand through his hair. A gesture of frustration, or indecision, or both. June appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his, and father and daughter had a conversation Eleanor couldn't hear, but could read in their body language. June pleading, Samuel resisting. Finally, Samuel knelt before his daughter, taking her shoulders gently. He spoke, and June's face crumpled. She threw her arms around his neck and Samuel held her, his own face buried in her dark hair. When they pulled apart, both of them were wiping their eyes. Samuel stood, lifted June back into the wagon, and climbed up beside her. This time, he didn't hesitate. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled away down the street, carrying them out of sight. Eleanor turned away from the window, throat tight. It was done. She was alone again, as she'd been alone on that station platform yesterday. But this felt different, worse, somehow. Yesterday she'd been abandoned by a man she'd loved from a distance, a romantic notion more than a reality. Today she'd been left by a man she barely knew, but who'd shown her more genuine kindness in 12 hours than Henry Braddock had shown in 6 months of courtship, and by a little girl who'd looked at her with such hope, such desperate longing for a mother's love. Mrs. Henderson returned with tea and settled into the chair across from Eleanor. So, she said without preamble, what's your story? Eleanor almost laughed at the directness. Is it that obvious I have one? Dear, everyone who ends up in Bitter Creek has a story, usually not a happy one. This isn't the kind of place people come to. It's the kind of place people end up. So Eleanor told her. Not everything. She couldn't bear to speak Henry's name aloud, but enough. The failed engagement, the train west, the wedding dress, Samuel stopping his wagon, June's attachment, the impossible situation she'd found herself in. Mrs. Henderson listened without interrupting, her expression growing more thoughtful as the story unfolded. When Eleanor finished, the older woman sat back and sipped her tea. Samuel Kane, she said slowly, has been a ghost of himself since Mara died. That little girl has been trying to bring him back to life for 2 years, but grief's got hooks in him that won't let go. She fixed Eleanor with a penetrating stare. You look like her. Mara, I mean. Not exactly, but enough. Eleanor had guessed as much, but hearing it confirmed made something twist in her chest. I'm not a replacement, she said sharply. I'm not trying to— Peace, child. I'm not accusing you of anything. Mrs. Henderson set down her teacup. I'm just saying that's complicated territory. Man sees his dead wife's ghost in your face every time he looks at you. That's a hell of a foundation for anything, friendship or otherwise. I'm not looking for anything from Samuel Kane, Eleanor said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. I just need a place to figure out what comes next. Fair enough. Mrs. Henderson rose. I've got a room on the second floor, small but clean. $3 a week, includes breakfast and supper. You said you'd work? Yes, anything. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I'm reasonably skilled with a needle. Can you handle accounts? My eyes aren't what they used to be, and my record-keeping has gotten sloppy. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. I can. I used to help my father with his ledgers before he died. Then we have an arrangement. Work 4 hours a day on the books and general help around the house, and I'll reduce your rent to $1 a week. That fair? More than fair. Suspiciously generous, actually. Eleanor searched Mrs. Henderson's face for ulterior motives, but found only kindness and perhaps a hint of mischief. Why are you being so kind to me? Mrs. Henderson smiled. Because Samuel Kane stopped his wagon for you, and Samuel Kane hasn't stopped for anything or anyone since the day he buried his wife. That tells me something, even if he doesn't know it himself yet. He was just being decent, Eleanor protested. Nothing more. Maybe. Mrs. Henderson headed for the door, then paused. Or maybe God put you on that platform at exactly the right moment. I've lived long enough to know the difference between coincidence and providence. This feels like providence to me. She left Eleanor alone to unpack in a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. Eleanor hung up her dresses, arranged her few possessions on the bureau, and sat on the edge of the bed with June's pink ribbon still tied around her wrist. What was she supposed to do now? Mrs. Henderson's generosity had bought her time, but time to do what? She couldn't stay in Bitter Creek indefinitely, working for room and board, existing without purpose or future. That wasn't a life, that was just a slower way of dying. But going back to Virginia meant facing Aunt Letitia's scorn, becoming a burden, living as a cautionary tale. At least here, nobody knew her story. Here, she could reinvent herself, become someone new. Except she couldn't, because Samuel Kane and his daughter already knew the truth. Already knew she was a woman abandoned, foolish enough to come west for a man who hadn't wanted her. Eleanor pulled June's ribbon from her wrist and held it up to the light filtering through the window. The pink had faded to almost nothing, the fabric soft with age and wear. Mara had worn this. Mara, who'd died giving birth to June. Mara, who looked enough like Eleanor to make a 4-year-old gasp in recognition. I'm not your replacement, Eleanor whispered to the woman who'd never hear her. I'm not trying to take your place. But even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Eleanor rose early, helped Mrs. Henderson with breakfast for the handful of boarders, then spent the morning working on the accounts. The ledgers were indeed a mess, but Eleanor had a talent for numbers and organization. She created new systems, reconciled discrepancies, even identified areas where Mrs. Henderson was losing money through inefficiency. You're a godsend, the older woman declared after a week. Best investment I ever made. Eleanor threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction. She didn't allow herself to think about Samuel and June, didn't allow herself to wonder if they thought about her. She was building a new life, one careful brick at a time. But Bitter Creek was a small town, and privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Within days, Eleanor heard the whispers. The abandoned bride. The woman Samuel Kane had rescued. Some of the townspeople viewed her with pity, others with suspicion. A few of the unmarried men began finding excuses to visit the boarding house, their intentions transparent. Eleanor rebuffed them all politely, but firmly. She had no interest in replacing one hasty engagement with another. If she'd learned anything from Henry Braddock, it was that desperation made poor decisions. 2 weeks after her arrival, Eleanor was in the general store purchasing supplies for Mrs. Henderson when she heard a familiar voice. "Daddy, can we get peppermints, please?" Eleanor turned to see June Kane standing on tiptoe at the counter, trying to peer into the candy jar. Samuel stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, looking uncomfortable in the crowded store. His eyes found Eleanor's across the room, and for a moment neither of them moved. June turned, following her father's gaze, and her face lit up like sunrise. "Miss Eleanor!" The child launched herself across the store, dodging other customers with the fearless agility of the very young. She crashed into Eleanor's legs, wrapping her arms around Eleanor's waist. "You're still here! You didn't leave!" Eleanor knelt, gathering June into a proper embrace. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm still here. I missed you. Daddy says I shouldn't bother you, but I missed you so much." "You're never a bother." Eleanor looked up to find Samuel standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Hello, Samuel." "Miss Whitfield." He nodded stiffly. "June, let Miss Whitfield go. She's busy." "I'm not that busy," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. She stood, keeping one hand on June's shoulder. "How have you both been?" "Fine," Samuel said curtly. At the same time, June said, "Terrible." Samuel closed his eyes briefly. "June, well, it's true. You're sad all the time, and you won't talk, and you burned the biscuits 3 times, and that's enough." Samuel's voice carried an edge of desperation. To Eleanor, "We're fine. House is standing. Chores are getting done. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." The dismissal stung, but Eleanor kept her expression neutral. "I'm glad to hear it." An awkward silence fell. Other customers were watching now, not even pretending to be interested in their shopping. Eleanor could feel the weight of their curiosity, their speculation. The abandoned bride and the widowed rancher. Of course, people were watching. June, oblivious to the tension, tugged on Eleanor's hand. "Will you come visit us, please? Daddy said maybe you would, but you haven't, and I drew you a picture, and—" "June." Samuel's voice was quiet but firm. "Miss Whitfield is settling into her new life. She doesn't need to visit us." "But I want her to visit." "What you want and what's appropriate aren't always the same thing." Eleanor saw June's face crumple and felt something in her chest crack. She knelt again, taking the child's hands. "I would love to see your picture," she said gently. "And I'd love to visit if your father says it's all right. But he's right. I've been busy getting settled. It's not that I don't want to see you." "Really?" June's eyes were swimming with tears. "You really want to?" "Really?" June looked up at her father with desperate hope. "Daddy, can she? Please?" Samuel's jaw worked, his dark eyes moving from his daughter to Eleanor and back again. Eleanor could see the war playing out across his face, the desire to protect June from further attachment, warring with his inability to deny her anything. "Sunday," he finally said. "If Miss Whitfield wants to come out on Sunday, she's welcome to join us for dinner." It was the last thing Eleanor had expected. She stared at him, trying to read his expression, but his face had gone carefully blank again. "I don't want to impose," she said carefully. "You're not. June wants to see you, and I—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "It would be fine, if you want to come." It wasn't exactly a warm invitation, but June was bouncing with excitement, and Eleanor found herself nodding before she could think better of it. "Sunday, then." "Thank you." Samuel nodded once and turned to the shopkeeper. 2 pounds of flour, pound of sugar, and a tin of coffee. While he conducted his business, June chattered at Eleanor about everything she'd been doing. The new calf that had been born, the book her father was reading to her, the rabbit she'd seen in the garden. Eleanor listened, making appropriate responses, hyper-aware of Samuel's presence a few feet away. When his purchases were wrapped, Samuel collected them and nodded to Eleanor. "We should go. Long ride back." June hugged Eleanor fiercely. "Sunday. Don't forget." "I won't forget, sweetheart." Eleanor watched them leave, June skipping beside her father, chattering away while Samuel listened with that same patient weariness. At the door, Samuel glanced back, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second before he turned away. Eleanor completed her shopping in a daze, barely hearing Mrs. Henderson's questions when she returned to the boarding house. Sunday. She was going to the ranch on Sunday. It meant nothing. It was just dinner with a little girl who was lonely and a father who couldn't deny his daughter anything. It meant nothing. So why did Eleanor's hands shake as she put away the supplies? Why did her heart hammer like she'd run a mile? Why did she catch herself that night trying to decide what to wear on Sunday? Mrs. Henderson noticed, of course. The woman noticed everything. "Samuel Kane invited you to Sunday dinner," she said that evening, not quite a question. Eleanor looked up from the ledger she'd been staring at without seeing. "How did you—" Bertha Mills was in the general store. She told Constance Wright. Constance told her sister. Her sister told me. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "That's how news travels in Bitter Creek. Speed of gossip." "It's just dinner, for June's sake." "Of course it is." Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested she believed nothing of the kind. "Just be careful, Eleanor. That man is still bleeding from wounds that haven't closed, and you're still figuring out who you are now that you're not Henry Braddock's intended. Two broken people can either heal together or cut each other to ribbons. Make sure you know which it's going to be before you get too deep." Eleanor wanted to protest that she wasn't broken, that she was fine, that this was just a simple Sunday dinner. But the words wouldn't come because they would have been lies. She was broken. Samuel was broken. And on Sunday, they would sit across a table from each other and pretend otherwise, for the sake of a little girl who'd already lost too much. Eleanor closed the ledger and climbed the stairs to her small room. She stood at the window, looking out at the darkening street, and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. In the distance, beyond the edge of town, she could just barely see the mountains where Samuel Kane's ranch lay. Tomorrow those mountains would be there. The day after, they'd still be there. And on Sunday, Eleanor would ride toward them, toward a man she barely knew and a child she was growing to love far too quickly. Mrs. Henderson's warning echoed in her mind. Two broken people can either heal together or cut each other to ribbons. Eleanor touched the pink ribbon she'd tied around her bedpost and prayed she'd have the wisdom to know the difference before it was too late. Sunday seemed both impossibly far away and rushing toward her at terrible speed. And Eleanor Whitfield, who'd come west to be a bride and ended up something else entirely, could only wait and wonder what came next. Sunday arrived with deceptive gentleness, the kind of crystalline winter morning that made the harsh Montana landscape look almost forgiving. Eleanor woke before dawn, her stomach knotted with an anxiety she couldn't quite name. It was just dinner, just a few hours with Samuel and June, nothing more complicated than that. She told herself this lie while selecting her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. Told herself again while pinning up her hair with more care than usual. And again while Mrs. Henderson packed a basket with fresh bread and preserves, smiling knowingly but saying nothing. Samuel had said he'd come for her at noon. By 11:30, Eleanor was pacing the boarding house parlor, checking the window every few minutes like a girl awaiting her first caller. Mrs. Henderson finally shooed her outside. "You're making me nervous, and I'm not even the one going. Wait on the porch where you can breathe." So Eleanor stood on the porch, the basket at her feet, watching the street and trying to calm her racing heart. What was wrong with her? She'd faced down her aunt's disapproval, survived the humiliation of abandonment, crossed half a continent alone. Why should one simple dinner undo her so completely? Because it wasn't simple, a voice in her head whispered. Because Samuel Kane had looked at her in that general store with something raw and uncertain in his eyes. Because June had wrapped her arms around Eleanor's waist like she was holding on to salvation itself. Because somewhere between that frozen train platform and this moment, Eleanor had stopped running from her old life and started hoping for a new one. And hope, she was learning, was the most terrifying thing of all. The wagon appeared at 5 minutes past noon, Samuel driving with his usual grim focus, while June practically vibrated with excitement beside him. The child spotted Eleanor and began waving frantically, nearly toppling from her seat before Samuel caught her with one arm. "Steady," Eleanor heard him say, his voice carrying the exasperation of a man who'd said the same thing 1,000 times. "You fall out. You're walking the rest of the way." June paid him no mind. The moment the wagon stopped, She scrambled down and launched herself at Eleanor with the full-body enthusiasm only children possess. "You came. You really came. I told Daddy you would, but he said maybe you'd change your mind, but I knew you wouldn't because you promised." Eleanor caught her, laughing despite her nervousness. "I always keep my promises, sweetheart." Samuel climbed down more slowly, his movements stiff. He'd made an effort today, Eleanor noticed. His hair was combed back, his shirt clean and pressed, his jaw freshly shaved. He looked younger without the perpetual shadow of stubble, more vulnerable somehow. "Miss Whitfield." He nodded, then noticed the basket. "You didn't need to bring anything." "Mrs. Henderson insisted, fresh bread and her blackberry preserves. She said to tell you hello." Something flickered in Samuel's expression, amusement perhaps, or resignation. "Mrs. Henderson's been trying to marry me off since Mara died. This will only encourage her." "I can take the basket back if it's a problem." "No." He reached for it, his hand brushing hers briefly in the transfer. Eleanor felt the contact like an electric shock. "It's kind. Tell her I said thank you." He helped Eleanor into the wagon with the same careful courtesy he'd shown that first night, his hands solid on her waist. June wedged herself between them, talking nonstop about everything they were going to do. Show Eleanor the new calf, introduce her to all the horses, make her try Daddy's biscuits, even though they were always too hard, play with her dolls, read her favorite story. "June, breathe," Samuel said mildly. "Miss Whitfield hasn't agreed to any of that yet." "It all sounds wonderful," Eleanor assured June, whose face had fallen at her father's words. "I'd love to meet the animals and see your dolls." June beamed and settled against Eleanor's side with a contented sigh. Samuel glanced over, his expression unreadable, then clicked to the horses and they started moving. The ride to the ranch was nothing like that first desperate journey. Then, Eleanor had been numb with shock and cold, barely aware of her surroundings. Now, in daylight, she could appreciate the stark beauty of the landscape, the endless white plains broken by dark stands of pine, the mountains rising like cathedral walls in the distance, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. Harsh country, yes, but honest. Nothing hidden, nothing pretended. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said softly. Samuel glanced at her, surprised. "Most people think it's desolate." "It is desolate. That's part of the beauty. Nothing here that doesn't need to be, no artifice." He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "You sound like Mara. She used to say almost the same thing." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "No, it's—" Samuel looked away, jaw working. "It's fine. It's just been a long time since anyone understood why I stay here. Most people think I'm punishing myself." "Are you?" The question came out before Eleanor could stop it. Samuel's hands tightened on the reins, and she thought he wouldn't answer, then quietly, "Maybe. At first. But now it's just home. The only place that makes sense anymore." June, who'd been listening with the intense focus children bring to adult conversations they're not supposed to understand, piped up, "Mama's buried here. That's why we can't leave. Daddy visits her every Sunday after church." Samuel's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "June, that's private." "But it's true. You said we have to stay close to Mama so she's not lonely." Eleanor's throat tightened. She looked at Samuel and saw him staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. A man trapped between honoring his dead wife's memory and raising a daughter who needed him present in the world of the living. "I'm sure your mother appreciates that," Eleanor said gently to June. "And I'm sure she's proud of what a thoughtful, kind girl you're growing into." June considered this. "Do you think she can see me? From heaven?" "I think if heaven is any kind of heaven at all, mothers can always see their children." Samuel made a sound, half breath, half something else, and turned his face away, but not before Eleanor saw the grief that cracked through his carefully maintained composure. She wanted to say something, offer comfort, bridge the terrible distance between them. But what could she say? She was the stranger here, the interloper who'd stumbled into their carefully balanced grief. The ranch appeared ahead, the house and barn looking somehow more solid in daylight. Smoke curled from the chimney. Samuel must have banked the fire before leaving. A dog emerged from the barn, barking once before recognizing Samuel and trotting over to investigate the wagon. "That's Bear," June announced. "He's not very smart, but he's nice. Mama named him before she died." Everything circled back to Mara. Eleanor was beginning to understand that this house, this ranch, this entire life was a shrine to a woman who'd been gone 2 years, but whose presence still dominated every corner, every conversation, every breath Samuel and June took. Samuel helped Eleanor down from the wagon while June ran ahead with the dog, calling back instructions about where Eleanor should put her cloak and which chair was the comfortable one and whether she preferred coffee or tea. The house was exactly as Eleanor remembered. Spare but clean, functional but not without warmth. Someone had added wood to the fire, and the room was pleasantly warm. But it was different in daylight, and Eleanor could see things she'd missed that first night. A woman's shawl still draped over the rocking chair. A pair of small boots by the door, far too small for June's current feet, baby shoes lovingly preserved. A sampler on the wall, meticulously stitched. "Home is where the heart lives." M.K., 1881. Mara Kane. Her handiwork still decorated the walls. Her shawl still warmed the chair. Her presence still filled every space, as real as if she just stepped outside and might return at any moment. Eleanor felt like she was trespassing in a mausoleum. Samuel noticed her noticing. He cleared his throat roughly. "June, show Miss Whitfield to the barn. Introduce her to the horses. I'll get dinner started." "Can Miss Eleanor help cook? She's really good at cooking. Mrs. Henderson said so." "June." Samuel's voice held a warning note, but June had already taken Eleanor's hand and was tugging her toward the door. "Please, Daddy, it's more fun with more people. Mama used to let me help too." Eleanor saw Samuel flinch at the comparison. Before he could refuse, she spoke up. "I'd be happy to help if you'd like. But if you'd rather I stayed out of your kitchen, I understand completely." Samuel looked trapped, his eyes moving between Eleanor and his hopeful daughter. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Fine, but June shows you the animals first. Dinner won't be ready for an hour." June cheered and dragged Eleanor outside before either adult could change their minds. The barn was warmer than expected, filled with the comforting smell of hay and horses and honest work. June introduced Eleanor to each horse by name and personality. Rosie's replacement was Daisy, a gentle mare who nuzzled Eleanor's palm looking for treats. There was Samson, Samuel's riding horse, massive and intimidating. June's pony, Buttercup, who was apparently prone to stubbornness. 2 draft horses, steady and patient. "And that's the new calf," June said, pointing to a spindly-legged creature in one of the stalls. "She was born in the snow. Daddy said she probably wouldn't make it, but I prayed really hard, and she did. Her name is Hope." Eleanor looked at the calf, at June's proud smile, and felt something shift in her chest. Hope. This little girl, who'd lost her mother and lived in a house haunted by grief, had named a calf Hope. "She's beautiful," Eleanor managed past the tightness in her throat. "You must be taking very good care of her." "I try. Daddy does most of it, but I help. Mama used to say that caring for things is how we show God we're grateful." June's face grew wistful. "I don't remember her voice anymore. Sometimes I try really hard, but it's just gone." Eleanor knelt in the hay beside June, heedless of her good dress. "What do you remember?" Her hands, they were soft, and she smelled like bread and lavender, and she used to sing me songs at bedtime. June's voice dropped to a whisper. "Daddy doesn't sing anymore. I asked him once, and he said his voice forgot how." "Sometimes grief makes us forget things," Eleanor said carefully, "but that doesn't mean they're gone forever. Maybe your daddy's voice just needs time to remember." "How much time? It's been 2 whole years." "How did you explain to a child that some griefs never healed, only scabbed over enough to survive?" Eleanor didn't have an answer, so she simply pulled June close and held her, this little girl who'd lost so much and still had room in her heart for hope. They stayed that way for several minutes, sitting in the hay while the horses shifted in their stalls, and the calf named Hope nursed from her mother. Eventually, June pulled back and wiped her eyes. "I'm glad you're here," she said simply. "Daddy is too, even if he won't say it. He smiles more when you're around. Not big smiles, but little ones, like he's remembering how. Eleanor's heart clenched. June, sweetheart, I need you to understand something. I care about you very much, but I'm not your mother. I can't replace her. I know that. June looked at Eleanor with an earnestness that was almost painful. But maybe you could be something else. Maybe you could be you, and that would be enough. The simple wisdom of it left Eleanor speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Samuel appeared in the barn doorway. Dinner's ready, if you two are done playing in the hay. His tone was light, but his eyes were serious as they moved from June to Eleanor. How much had he heard? Eleanor rose quickly, brushing straw from her skirt, suddenly self-conscious. They returned to the house, where Samuel had laid out a simple but substantial meal. Venison stew, fresh biscuits that were indeed quite hard, boiled potatoes, and Mrs. Henderson's bread with her preserves. They sat at the small table, June chattering about the horses, while Samuel served food with careful efficiency. Eleanor took a bite of the stew and had to suppress a sound of surprise. It was excellent, rich, perfectly seasoned, the meat tender and flavorful. Samuel, watching her reaction, raised an eyebrow. Not what you expected? I didn't expect anything, but this is wonderful. You're a good cook. Had to learn. June needed to eat, and burned food wasn't going to keep her healthy. He said it matter-of-factly, but Eleanor heard the story beneath the words. A man teaching himself to cook because his wife was gone and his daughter needed care. Learning to braid hair, probably. To mend clothes. To do all the things a mother would do because he had no other choice. The biscuits are a work in progress, he added wryly. Eleanor tried one and had to agree, hard as rocks, but she smiled anyway. They're not that bad. You're a terrible liar. Maybe, but I appreciate the effort. Something passed between them across the table, a moment of understanding, of shared humor, of connection. Then June knocked over her water, and the moment fractured into the practical chaos of cleaning up, finding a cloth, reassuring the child that accidents happened. But the warmth remained. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than Eleanor had expected. Samuel asked about her work with Mrs. Henderson, and Eleanor found herself describing the boarding house's accounts with more animation than she'd felt in weeks. He listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions about her system for organizing the ledgers. You have a head for numbers, he observed. My father was a banker. He taught me young, said women needed to understand money as much as men did, maybe more. Smart man. He was. Eleanor felt the familiar ache of loss, duller now, but still present. He died when I was 19. My mother had passed 2 years before that. That's when I went to live with my aunt in Richmond. Samuel nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. And that's where you met? He stopped, glancing at June. Yes, Eleanor said quietly. That's where I met the man I thought I'd marry. She waited for the questions, the pity, the judgment. But Samuel simply nodded again and returned to his meal. His acceptance of her story, his lack of intrusive curiosity, felt like a gift. After dinner, while Samuel washed dishes, Eleanor sat with June on the floor near the fire and was introduced to an extensive collection of dolls, each with an elaborate backstory. One was a princess fleeing an evil stepmother. One was a frontier doctor who'd saved an entire town from illness. One was a mother who'd gone to heaven but visited her children in dreams. Eleanor listened to June's stories, marveling at the child's imagination and emotional intelligence. This little girl understood loss in a way no child should have to, yet she'd transformed that understanding into stories of resilience and hope. Samuel watched from the sink, his hands stilled in the dishwater. Eleanor could feel his gaze on her, assessing, wondering, perhaps hoping for something he didn't dare name. The afternoon slipped away in unexpected ease. Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since before Henry's betrayal. Here, in this small house full of ghosts and grief, she felt strangely at peace. June's laughter filled the corners that silence usually claimed. Samuel's rare smiles, when they came, transformed his hard face into something almost gentle. They read stories. June insisted on 3. Negotiating like a seasoned diplomat for just one more. Eleanor read 2, Samuel read 1, his deep voice giving weight to the simple tale of a brave little mouse. June fell asleep halfway through, her head in Eleanor's lap, one hand still clutching her favorite doll. Samuel lifted his daughter carefully, carrying her to the bedroom. Eleanor heard him murmuring something soft, too quiet to make out the words. When he returned, his expression was unguarded for once, vulnerable in the dying light. "She doesn't warm to people easily," he said quietly, "but she's warmed to you. She's a special child. You've raised her well. I've kept her alive. That's not the same as raising her well." Samuel sat in the rocking chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "She needs things I can't give her, woman things, gentle things. I'm too hard for that." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "You're exactly what she needs, a father who loves her enough to do the difficult things, to learn to cook and clean and braid hair, to keep living when everything in you wanted to stop. That's not being too hard, that's being strong enough." Samuel's jaw worked. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "Why did you really come today, Eleanor?" The use of her first name sent a shiver through her. She met his eyes across the small room, seeing in them a reflection of her own confusion, her own tentative hope. "Because June asked me to," she said honestly, "and because I wanted to." "Why?" "I don't know." But that was a lie, and they both knew it. Eleanor drew a breath. "Maybe because for the first time since I got on that train west, I felt like I mattered to someone, not as a bride or a burden or a cautionary tale, just as myself." Samuel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his dark eyes intense. "You look like her. Mara. June said it that first day, and she was right. Every time I look at you, I see her, and it's—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "It's not fair to you. I know I look like her. I'm not blind." Eleanor kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But I'm not her, Samuel. I'm not trying to be her. I'm just trying to figure out who I am now that everything I thought I wanted turned out to be a lie." "And what have you figured out?" "That I'm stronger than I thought. That I can survive things I didn't think I could survive. That maybe being abandoned was the best thing that ever happened to me because it forced me to become someone real instead of someone's reflection." Samuel absorbed this in silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house. Finally, he spoke again. "June's getting too attached. To you. It's going to hurt her when you leave." "Who says I'm leaving?" "Aren't you? Eventually? This isn't your home. You don't belong here." The words stung, but Eleanor refused to flinch. "Maybe not yet. But belonging isn't something you're born with. It's something you build. And I'm tired of running, Samuel. I'm tired of being afraid. Maybe I don't belong here today, but that doesn't mean I can't belong here tomorrow." Samuel stared at her, and Eleanor watched emotions chase across his face. Fear, hope, resistance, longing. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Whatever he'd been about to say remained trapped behind his careful defenses. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility and danger. Then Samuel rose abruptly, turning toward the window. "It's getting late. I should take you back to town." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to push, wanted to demand he stop hiding behind his grief and see her, really see her, but she simply nodded and stood. "Thank you for today, for the meal, for your hospitality. It meant a great deal to me. June enjoyed having you here." He still wouldn't look at her. "And you? Did you enjoy it?" Samuel's shoulders tensed. A long silence. Then quietly, "Yes. God help me. Yes." Eleanor's breath caught. Before she could respond, Samuel was moving, fetching her cloak, preparing the wagon with sharp, efficient movements that spoke of desperation to be busy, to not have to feel whatever was churning inside him. The ride back to town was silent, but it was different from the earlier silences. This one vibrated with unspoken words, with the weight of admissions almost made, with the dangerous territory they'd both approached but neither dared cross. When they reached the boarding house, Samuel helped Eleanor down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. In the dying light, his face was shadowed, unreadable. "Eleanor," he said, then stopped. "Yes?" "I can't—" He shook his head, frustration tightening his features. "This isn't fair to you. You deserve better than a man who can't stop seeing his dead wife's face in yours." Eleanor stepped closer, near enough to feel his warmth despite the cold. "Then stop looking for her and see me instead." Samuel's hand came up, almost touching her cheek before he jerked it back. "I don't know if I can." "Then I'll wait until you figure it out." "Don't." His voice was anguished. "Don't wait for me. Don't put your life on hold for a broken man who might never heal." "Too late." Eleanor smiled sadly. "I'm already waiting." She turned and walked up the steps to the boarding house without looking back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside, Mrs. Henderson was waiting with knowing eyes and hot tea, but Eleanor went straight to her room without speaking. She stood at the window, watching the street below, and saw Samuel still sitting in his wagon, unmoving. Minutes passed. 5. 10. Finally, he picked up the reins and drove away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Eleanor touched the window glass, cold against her palm. She'd been honest with him. She was waiting. But for what? For him to stop mourning? To see her as someone other than his dead wife's echo? To take a chance on something new when he was still bleeding from old wounds? She didn't have answers, only questions and hope and the memory of his voice saying, "God help me, yes." In the days that followed, Eleanor tried to maintain her routine, but everything had shifted. The work at the boarding house continued, but her thoughts kept drifting to that ranch, to a little girl with dark curls and a man learning to smile again. Mrs. Henderson watched her with concerned eyes, but said nothing. Then, 4 days after Sunday dinner, June appeared at the boarding house. She was alone, snow-dusted and breathless, and Eleanor's heart nearly stopped when she opened the door and found the child standing on the porch. "June? What are you doing here? Where's your father?" "At home. He doesn't know I came." June's eyes were red from crying. "Please, Miss Eleanor, you have to come. Something's wrong with Daddy." Fear flooded Eleanor's veins. "What do you mean? Is he hurt?" "Not hurt, sick. He woke up this morning with a fever, and he won't stay in bed, and he's trying to do chores, and he's so hot. Miss Eleanor, he's burning up, and I don't know what to do." Eleanor was already grabbing her cloak. "How did you get here?" "I took Buttercup. Daddy will be so angry, but I didn't know what else to do. Mrs. Henderson was the closest, but you helped when I was sick that first night you came. Daddy said you saved me, so I thought—" "You thought right." Eleanor knelt, gripping June's shoulders. "You're very brave. Now, can you ride back with me? On Buttercup?" June nodded quickly. Eleanor called up the stairs to Mrs. Henderson, explaining in rushed words. The older woman appeared with a bag already packed. Herbs, clean cloths, basic medicines. "Go," she said simply. "I'll send word if I need to." Eleanor and June rode through the snow, June clinging to Eleanor's waist, Buttercup moving as fast as her short legs would carry her. The journey that had taken an hour in the wagon took nearly 2 on the pony, and by the time they reached the ranch, Eleanor was sick with worry. The house was cold, the fire nearly out. Eleanor found Samuel in the barn, mucking stalls with shaking hands, his face flushed with fever and his shirt soaked with sweat. "Samuel Kane, what in God's name are you doing?" He turned, and she saw his eyes were glassy with fever. "Chores. Animals don't care if you're sick." "Inside. Now." "I can't. Now, Samuel." Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. And even through his fever haze, Samuel recognized the tone of someone not to be argued with. He let her guide him to the house, June running ahead to stoke the fire. Getting Samuel to bed was like trying to move a stubborn mule. He insisted he was fine, that he just needed coffee, that the animals needed tending. Eleanor finally lost patience. "If you die of pneumonia, who takes care of June? Now lie down before I knock you down." The mention of June deflated his resistance. He collapsed onto the bed, shivering despite the fever burning through him. Eleanor sent June to heat water and fetch every blanket in the house, then set about stripping Samuel's wet shirt. His skin was fire-hot, his breathing labored. This wasn't just a simple cold. This was serious. Eleanor's mind raced through everything her mother had taught her about fevers, about pneumonia, about the fine line between illness and death. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, sponging Samuel's burning skin with cool water, forcing willow bark tea between his cracked lips, monitoring his breathing for signs of fluid in his lungs. June helped where she could, fetching and carrying, her small face pinched with fear. "He's not going to die, is he?" she whispered once. "Like Mama did?" "Not if I can help it," Eleanor said fiercely. "I promise you, June. I promise." It was a promise she had no right to make, but she made it anyway. And as the long night stretched ahead, Eleanor Kane sat beside a man who wasn't hers, in a house that wasn't hers. Fighting for a life that had barely begun to include her, she understood something fundamental had changed. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was already home. She just needed Samuel to wake up and realize it too. The fever raged on, and Eleanor kept her vigil, refusing to let death claim another person in this house, not while she still had breath, not while hope still lived. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, a woman who'd come west to be a bride became something else entirely. A fighter, a healer, a woman who'd found her strength in the simple act of refusing to let go. And in his fevered dreams, Samuel Kane heard singing, a voice he didn't recognize but that felt like coming home. The fever broke just before dawn on the third day. Eleanor, slumped in the chair beside Samuel's bed where she'd maintained her vigil for 72 hours, jolted awake when she heard him stir. His eyes opened, truly opened, clear and aware for the first time since she'd found him collapsing in the barn. "Eleanor?" His voice was rough, barely more than a rasp, but it was coherent. He was back. "Don't try to sit up." She pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "You've been very ill. Pneumonia, I think, or close to it." Samuel blinked, taking in his surroundings with obvious confusion. He was in his own bed, but Eleanor was there, dark circles under her eyes, her hair escaping its pins, wearing what looked like one of his work shirts over her dress. June was curled at the foot of the bed, fast asleep on top of the quilts. "How long?" he managed. 3 days. June rode to town to get me. You were in the barn, trying to work with a fever high enough to boil water." Eleanor's hands shook as she poured him water from the pitcher beside the bed. "Here." Small sips. He drank gratefully, wincing at the rawness in his throat. "June rode alone? To town?" She was terrified. "She thought you were dying." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "So did I, at first. Your fever was so high, Samuel. I've never seen anyone burn like that and survive." Samuel absorbed this information slowly, his gaze moving from Eleanor's exhausted face to his sleeping daughter. "You stayed, the whole time. Where else would I be?" "In town. At the boarding house. Living your life instead of nursing a stubborn fool who doesn't know when to rest." Eleanor sat back, suddenly aware of how close she'd been sitting, how intimate this all was. "June needed me, and you—" She stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. "I needed you too," Samuel said quietly. His eyes held hers, and something in them was different. The walls had come down, or perhaps the fever had burned them away. "I heard you singing. For a moment I thought it was Mara, but it wasn't. It was you." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. She'd sung without thinking, the lullabies her own mother had taught her, songs to soothe and comfort. "I didn't think you'd hear. You were so far away. I heard everything. You arguing with me about staying in bed, you telling June I'd be fine, you praying." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "You promised her I wouldn't die. I had no right to promise that, but I couldn't. June had already lost so much. I couldn't let her lose you too." Samuel's hand moved slowly, finding hers where it rested on the edge of the bed. His fingers were still weak, trembling slightly, but his grip was firm. "Thank you for staying, for fighting for me when I was too far gone to fight for myself." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, her throat tight. "You would have done the same." "Would I?" Samuel's laugh was bitter. "I'd convinced myself I was better off alone, that June and I were fine, just the two of us, that I didn't need anyone else, that needing anyone else was a betrayal of Mara." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "Then I woke up and found you here, looking like you'd been through hell, and I realized I'd been lying to myself. Samuel, let me finish, please. He squeezed her hand weakly. When I saw you on that platform in your wedding dress, crying in the snow, I should have driven past. Everything in me said to drive past. But June said you look like Mara, and I couldn't. And I've been telling myself it was just charity, just basic human decency. But that's a lie, too. Eleanor's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. Then what was it? Recognition. Samuel's dark eyes searched her face. You were broken. I was broken. And for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel so alone in my breaking. The words hung between them, raw and honest. June stirred at the foot of the bed, mumbling something in her sleep, and they both fell silent, waiting. But the child simply rolled over and settled again, lost in dreams that Eleanor hoped were kinder than reality. You should rest, Eleanor said finally, gently trying to extract her hand from his. You're still weak. The fever's broken, but you need to rebuild your strength. Eleanor, wait. Samuel didn't release her hand. I need to know, do you plan to stay? Here, in Bitter Creek? I don't know. I've been living day to day, trying not to think too far ahead. And if I asked you to stay? If I said... He stopped, frustration tightening his features. I'm not good with words. Never have been. Mara used to say I could go a whole day without speaking if left to my own devices. But I need you to understand something. What? You're not her. You're not a replacement or a substitute or a ghost. You're Eleanor Whitfield, and you're stubborn and brave, and you've got a gift for numbers, and you kept my daughter fed and safe, and you fought for my life like it mattered to you. Not because it should matter, not because it was the decent thing to do, but because it actually mattered. Eleanor's vision blurred. Of course it mattered. You matter, Samuel. You and June both. Then stay. His voice was urgent despite its weakness. Not as a guest, not as charity. Stay and let us figure out what this is between us. Give me time to prove I can see you instead of her. Give June the chance to have someone who cares about her. Give yourself the chance to build something real instead of running back to Virginia or running away to somewhere else. It was the most words Eleanor had ever heard him speak at once, and they hit her like a physical force. She wanted to say yes. God, how she wanted to say yes. But fear held her back. Fear of becoming a convenient replacement. Fear of June getting more attached only to lose another person she loved. Fear of giving her heart to a man still haunted by his wife's ghost. I need to think, she said carefully. It's a lot, Samuel. 3 days ago you told me not to wait for you. Now you're asking me to stay. I need to understand what changed. I almost died. Samuel's grip on her hand tightened. And when I was burning up with fever, barely able to tell dreams from reality, do you know what I kept thinking? Not about Mara, not about the past. I kept thinking about you. About how angry I was that I might die before I figured out how to tell you that you terrified me. Because you made me want to live again, and wanting to live felt like betraying everything I'd built my existence around for 2 years. Grief isn't something you betray, Eleanor said softly. It's something you carry. You'll always love Mara. She's June's mother. She'll always be part of your life. I know that. But there's a difference between carrying grief and being buried by it. I've been buried, Eleanor. For 2 years, I've been in the ground with Mara, just walking around and pretending I was alive. You made me realize I'd stopped living, and if I'm going to start again, I want you there. If you'll have me, us. June chose that moment to wake up, lifting her head groggily and blinking in the gray dawn light. When she saw her father awake and talking, her face split into a brilliant smile. Daddy, you're better. She scrambled up the bed, flinging herself at Samuel's chest with the careless enthusiasm of a child who didn't realize how fragile he still was. Samuel grunted at the impact, but wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. Easy, little one. I'm still pretty weak. But you're better. Miss Eleanor said you'd get better, and you did. She was right. June pulled back, her face serious. Daddy, can Miss Eleanor stay? Forever. Please? She took care of both of us, and she makes good biscuits, way better than yours. And she knows all the best stories, and she doesn't mind when I ask too many questions. Samuel's eyes met Eleanor's over June's head. That's up to Miss Eleanor, sweetheart. It's a big decision. She needs time to think about it. But what if she thinks and decides no? June's voice wavered. What if she leaves like everyone leaves? Eleanor couldn't bear the fear in the child's voice. She reached out, smoothing June's tangled hair. I'm not going anywhere today, sweetheart. Or tomorrow, I promise. But your father is right. This is a big decision. I need to be sure it's the right thing for all of us. June seemed to accept this, though her grip on her father remained tight. Okay, but think fast because we need you. The simple declaration made Eleanor's throat close. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and stood. You need breakfast, both of you. Let me see what I can make. She escaped to the main room, her hand shaking as she stoked the fire and began pulling together a simple meal. Her mind was spinning. Samuel was asking her to stay, not as a housekeeper or a nursemaid, but as what exactly? He hadn't said the words, hadn't made any specific promises, but the implication was clear. Stay, and let's see what we can build together. Could she do that? Could she give her heart to a man who'd loved his wife so deeply that 2 years after her death, he still visited her grave every Sunday? Could she live in a house where another woman's presence still lingered in every corner? Could she risk becoming attached to June, only to have Samuel decide he couldn't move past his grief after all? But the alternative was leaving. Going back to Virginia and Aunt Letitia's cold charity, or staying in town at the boarding house, always on the outside looking in at the life she might have had. Neither option felt like living. They both felt like slow deaths, different versions of the same surrender. Eleanor was still wrestling with these thoughts when Mrs. Henderson arrived mid-morning, driven out by one of her boarders who'd offered to check on the situation. The older woman took one look at Eleanor's face and pulled her aside. You look like you've been through a war, dear. How's Samuel? Fever broke this morning. He's weak but recovering. And you? How are you holding up? Eleanor's careful composure cracked. He asked me to stay, really stay, and I don't know what to do. Mrs. Henderson guided her to a chair and sat beside her, holding her hands. What does your heart say? My heart says yes. My heart has been saying yes since the moment I saw June's face light up when she saw me in town. But my head, your head is afraid. That's natural. You've been hurt, abandoned, forced to rebuild yourself from nothing. Of course you're afraid. Mrs. Henderson squeezed her hands. But fear is a terrible reason to say no to something that might make you happy. What if I'm just convenient? What if he only wants me because I look like his wife and June needs a mother? Did he say that? No, he said the opposite, actually. He said, I'm not her, that I'm myself, that he sees me. But what if that's just the fever talking? What if when he's fully recovered and thinking clearly, he realizes he made a mistake? Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment. Then, Eleanor, I've known Samuel Kane since he came to Montana 6 years ago. I knew Mara. I watched them build that ranch together, watched them become a family, and I watched him die inside when she passed. For 2 years, that man has been a ghost, going through the motions of living but not actually alive. Until you. I didn't do anything special. You did everything special. You showed up in his life at exactly the moment he needed someone to show him he could still feel. You fought for his daughter when he was too numb to see she was struggling. You fought for his life when he was too far gone to fight for himself. That's not convenient, Eleanor. That's providence. Eleanor wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this connection she felt to Samuel and June was real, not just the desperate grasping of lonely people. But doubt still gnawed at her. Give it time, Mrs. Henderson advised. Stay for a while. Let him recover. Let yourself see who he is when he's not delirious with fever or trying to push you away out of guilt. Then decide. But don't decide out of fear. Decide from a place of truth. It was good advice, and Eleanor clung to it as the days passed. She stayed at the ranch, sleeping in the main room on a makeshift bed of blankets by the fire, caring for Samuel as he slowly regained his strength. June was her constant companion, helping with cooking and cleaning, chattering endlessly about everything and nothing. Samuel, for his part, seemed determined to prove he was recovering faster than he actually was. Eleanor caught him trying to sneak outside to do chores on his 3rd day up, and she blocked the doorway with crossed arms and a glare that would have frozen water. Absolutely not. You're still weak as a kitten, and the last thing you need is a relapse. Back to bed. I can't just lie around while work piles up, Samuel protested. The animals need care, the barn needs mucking, there's all being handled. Mrs. Henderson sent word to Tom Brewster. He's doing your essential chores until you're strong enough to take over. Now, bed. Or do I need to have June sit on you to keep you there? June giggled from where she sat at the table. I'll do it, Daddy. Miss Eleanor taught me about being stubborn. She's really good at it. Samuel looked between them, his daughter grinning mischievously, and this woman who'd somehow taken over his house and his life, and surrendered. Fine, but I'm sitting in the chair, not lying in bed like an invalid. Compromise. I can live with that. Eleanor helped him to the rocking chair, where he settled with a grunt. She handed him the book he'd been reading to June, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. Here, make yourself useful. Read to us while I work on dinner. It became their routine. Samuel would read while Eleanor cooked, June would help or play nearby, and the house would fill with the sound of a deep voice bringing stories to life. Sometimes Eleanor would look up from chopping vegetables or stirring stew and find Samuel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, intense, searching, almost hungry. On the 5th day, when Samuel was finally strong enough to venture outside for short periods, Eleanor was in the barn milking the cow when he found her. She looked up, startled, as his shadow fell across the stall. You're supposed to be resting. I've been resting for days. I'm going stir-crazy. Samuel leaned against the stall door, watching her work with practiced efficiency. You're good at that. My grandmother had a farm in Loudoun County. I spent summers there as a child. Eleanor returned to her milking, suddenly self-conscious under his scrutiny. It comes back quickly. Eleanor. Samuel's voice was quiet but firm. When she looked up, his dark eyes were serious. Have you thought about what I asked? About staying? Her hand stilled on the cow's udder. I've thought about little else. And? Eleanor set aside the milk bucket and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. I have questions first, and I need you to answer them honestly, not just tell me what you think I want to hear. All right. Samuel straightened, tension visible in his shoulders. Ask. Do you see Mara when you look at me? He didn't answer immediately, and Eleanor braced herself for a lie or a platitude, but Samuel had never been one for either. Sometimes, he admitted, in certain lights, in certain moments, the resemblance is there. I won't pretend it isn't. And does that influence how you feel about me? It did. At first. It's why I tried so hard to push you away. I didn't want to confuse what I felt for you with what I felt for her. Samuel took a step closer. But these past days, having you here, watching you care for June and fight with me about doing chores and burn dinner twice, I did not burn dinner twice. The stew on Tuesday was definitely singed, and the biscuits yesterday were worse than mine. His lips quirked in the smallest smile. My point is, you're not her. You do things differently. You argue more. You're stubborn where she was gentle. You question where she accepted. And somewhere in all that, I stopped seeing her and started seeing you. Eleanor's heart was racing, but she forced herself to continue. What about June? She's already attached to me. What happens if this doesn't work? If you decide you can't move forward after all? Samuel's expression turned grave. That's the question that keeps me up at night. June's already lost one mother. If I let her get more attached to you and then things fall apart. He ran a hand through his hair. But I keep coming back to the same conclusion. June needs someone. I can't be both parents to her, no matter how hard I try. And more than that, she needs to see that love doesn't end with death, that it's possible to care deeply for more than one person in a lifetime, that new love doesn't erase old love. Is that what you think this is? Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Love? Samuel met her eyes directly. I don't know. It's too soon to call it that. But it's something. Something that could become love if we gave it time and honesty. Something worth fighting for. He paused. Unless you don't feel the same way. If I'm reading this wrong, if you're staying out of obligation or pity, it's not obligation. Eleanor's words came fast, certain. And it's definitely not pity. I stay because when I'm here, I feel like I matter. Like I'm building something real instead of just existing. Because June makes me laugh and you make me feel—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions. "You make me feel seen, not as someone's abandoned bride or charity case, just as me." Samuel closed the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle despite the calluses. "Then stay. Stay, and let us figure this out together. I can't promise it'll be easy. I'm still carrying grief. I'm still learning how to be alive again. But I can promise I'll try. I'll try to be the man you deserve instead of the ghost I've been." Eleanor's hands covered his, holding them against her cheeks. "I'm still figuring out who I am too. The woman who came west to marry Henry Braddock is gone. I'm still discovering who Eleanor Whitfield actually is beneath all the expectations and disappointments." "Then we'll figure it out together." Samuel's thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Say yes, Eleanor, please." "Yes." The word escaped as barely more than a breath. "Yes, I'll stay." Samuel's face transformed, the hard lines softening into something that looked almost like hope. He bent his head slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed his lips against her forehead in a kiss so gentle it made her ache. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin, "for giving us a chance, for giving me a chance." They stood that way for a long moment, forehead to forehead, breathing the same air. Then June's voice shattered the intimacy. "Does this mean Miss Eleanor is staying forever?" They pulled apart to find June standing in the barn doorway, clutching her doll and grinning like she'd just witnessed something magical. Eleanor laughed, wiping her eyes. "It means I'm staying for now, sweetheart. We'll figure out forever later." "That's good enough for me." June ran forward and wrapped her arms around both of them, creating an awkward 3-person embrace that was somehow perfect in its imperfection. Samuel caught Eleanor's eyes over June's head, and something passed between them. A promise, a hope, a tentative beginning. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a proposal. It was something more fragile and more honest, an agreement to try, to build, to see what might grow in the space between grief and hope. The days that followed had a different quality. Eleanor still slept by the fire, still maintained appropriate boundaries, but there was a new ease between her and Samuel. He no longer flinched when their hands accidentally touched. She no longer second-guessed every decision about June's care. They were learning to exist in the same space without the constant tension that had defined their earlier interactions. But the fragile peace was shattered 2 weeks later when a rider came. Eleanor was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching. A man on a fine horse, dressed too well for a ranch hand or passing traveler. Something about him set her teeth on edge even before he dismounted and swept off his hat. He was handsome in a cultivated way. Blonde hair carefully styled, mustache precisely trimmed, clothes expensive and well-maintained. And when his eyes landed on Eleanor, recognition flashed across his face, followed by something that might have been triumph. "Eleanor? Eleanor Whitfield?" Her blood turned to ice. She knew that voice, had heard it whisper promises and lies in equal measure. Henry Braddock had found her. Samuel emerged from the barn at that moment, taking in the stranger and Eleanor's white face with sharp attention. "Can I help you?" Henry's eyes moved from Eleanor to Samuel and back again, assessment and calculation in his gaze. "Henry Braddock, from Richmond, Virginia. I'm looking for Miss Eleanor Whitfield. I believe you know her." "What do you want, Henry?" Eleanor's voice was cold, steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "To speak with you, my dear, privately if possible." "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Mr. Kane." Henry's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Very well. I've come to bring you home, Eleanor. Your aunt is worried sick. Running off to Montana, living with strangers, it's created quite the scandal back home. But I'm prepared to overlook your indiscretion. If you come back with me now, we can salvage this situation." Eleanor stared at him, unable to quite believe what she was hearing. "Salvage what situation? You married someone else, Henry. You sent me a letter telling me not to come, but it arrived too late. Or did you forget? Catherine and I have separated. It turns out her father's connections weren't as valuable as promised. The marriage was a mistake." Henry took a step closer, his voice turning persuasive. But we can fix this, Eleanor. You and I. We can still have what we planned. I'll marry you, make you respectable again. No one needs to know about this unfortunate interlude. Samuel moved to stand beside Eleanor, his presence solid and protective. I think Miss Whitfield has made her position clear. She's not interested in returning to Virginia. Henry's eyes narrowed. And who are you exactly? Her protector? Her employer? His gaze raked over the ranch house, the barn, the modest surroundings. Or perhaps something else. Tell me, Eleanor, what exactly is your arrangement here? Living with a man and his child, no ring on your finger, one can only imagine what conclusions people might draw. That's enough. Samuel's voice had gone deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. You've said your piece. Now you can leave. I'm not leaving without Eleanor. Henry's veneer of civility cracked, revealing the arrogance beneath. She came west as my intended. She belongs to me, and I'm not going to let some backwoods farmer think he can steal what's mine. I never belonged to you. Eleanor stepped forward, anger finally cutting through her shock. You abandoned me, Henry. You chose Catherine and her father's money over me, and you did it in the most cowardly way possible. You don't get to come here now and claim ownership. Don't be dramatic, Eleanor. I'm offering you a way out of this mess. A respectable marriage, a return to civilization, a life that doesn't involve. He gestured dismissively at the ranch. This is my home now. Home? Henry laughed, but there was an edge to it. Eleanor, be reasonable. You've been playing house with a widower and his child for a few weeks. That's not a home. That's a fantasy. What happens when he realizes you're just a convenient replacement for his dead wife? What happens when he doesn't need you anymore? You'll be right back where you started, abandoned and alone. The words hit their target. Eleanor felt doubt creep in, insidious and cold. Wasn't that exactly what she'd feared? That she was just a convenient solution to Samuel's problems, a substitute mother for June, a ghost that looked enough like Mara to be comforting? Samuel must have seen something in her face because his hand found hers, squeezing gently. Eleanor knows exactly what she is to us, he said firmly. And it's not a replacement or a convenience. Now get off my property before I remove you myself. Henry's expression hardened. Fine. But understand this, Kane. Eleanor Whitfield came west under false pretenses. She was traveling to marry me. That makes her reputation my responsibility. And I will not allow her to destroy what's left of it by living in sin with a stranger. If she won't come willingly, I'll be forced to take other measures. What other measures? Eleanor demanded. Legal ones, if necessary. I've already contacted your aunt. She agrees that your behavior is unacceptable and that you need to be brought back to Virginia by force if required. As your closest male relative, I've been authorized to act on her behalf. You have no authority over me. Don't I? An unmarried woman living unchaperoned with a man in a territory where reputation is everything? Henry's smile was cruel. One word from me in town, and you'll be ruined, both of you. Is that what you want? For this man and his child to suffer because of your selfishness? Eleanor felt the trap closing around her. Henry was right about one thing. In a small town like Bitter Creek, reputation mattered. If he spread rumors, made accusations, it wouldn't matter that they were false. The damage would be done. Samuel could lose standing in the community. June could be ostracized, teased by other children, all because Eleanor had stayed. Give me time, she said quietly, to think. One day. Eleanor, no, Samuel started, but she cut him off with a look. One day, Henry. Then I'll give you my answer. Henry studied her, clearly suspecting a trap, but finally nodded. One day. I'm staying at the boarding house in town. I'll expect your answer by tomorrow evening. Choose wisely, Eleanor. This is your last chance at redemption. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving dust and poison in his wake. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand still in Samuel's, unable to process what had just happened. Samuel turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. You're not seriously considering going with him. He'll destroy you if I stay. You heard him. He'll spread rumors, make accusations. June will suffer. Let him try. Samuel's voice was fierce. I don't care what that pompous ass says or does. You're not going back to Virginia with him. You don't understand what he's capable of. Henry Braddock doesn't lose gracefully. If I refuse him, he'll make sure everyone knows I'm living here, unchaperoned. He'll paint me as your mistress, June as an innocent corrupted by my presence. Then marry me." Eleanor's words died in her throat. She stared at Samuel, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Marry me." Samuel said it louder this time, more certain. "If reputation is the issue, if that's what he's using against us, then we solve it. Marry me, Eleanor, not because you're cornered, not because it's convenient, but because it's what we both want, isn't it?" "Samuel, you can't. This isn't how. You don't propose because of blackmail and threats." "I'm not." He pulled her closer, his eyes intense. "I'm proposing because Henry Braddock showing up made me realize I could lose you, that you might actually leave. And the thought of that, of going back to the way things were before you, I can't do it, Eleanor. I won't survive it." Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face. "You're still grieving Mara. This is too fast. You need more time. I've had 2 years of being dead inside, of barely existing. You brought me back to life. You gave me a reason to fight, to heal, to be better than the broken ghost I've been. I love you, Eleanor Whitfield. Maybe I shouldn't yet. Maybe it's too soon, but I do. And if that bastard thinks he can take you away from me, from June, from the life we're building, he's wrong." Eleanor couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Samuel loved her. He had said it clearly and without reservation. The words she'd been afraid to hope for dropped into her lap in the midst of crisis and chaos. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since you gave me your coat in the snow. But this, marriage, it's such a big step. What about June? We should ask her." "Ask me what?" June had appeared from somewhere, her timing impeccable as always. She looked between her father and Eleanor, reading the situation with a child's uncanny intuition. "Are you asking Miss Eleanor to marry us?" "Yes," Samuel said firmly, "if she'll have us." June's face split into the biggest smile Eleanor had ever seen. "Say yes, please say yes. We need you, Miss Eleanor. We're so much better when you're here. Daddy smiles more, and the biscuits are better, and you tell the best stories, and—" "June, breathe," Samuel said. But he was smiling too, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Eleanor looked at them. This man who'd learned to love again, despite his grief. This child who'd already lost so much but still had room in her heart for hope, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. "Yes," she said, and then louder, more certain. "Yes, I'll marry you." June shrieked with joy and threw herself at Eleanor, wrapping her arms around her waist. Samuel pulled them both close, creating a circle of 3 that felt complete in a way nothing in Eleanor's life ever had. But even in that perfect moment, Eleanor couldn't forget the threat hanging over them. Henry Braddock wasn't going to accept defeat gracefully. Tomorrow, when she gave him her answer, there would be consequences. She just had to hope that the life she was choosing was worth whatever price they'd have to pay. That night, after June was asleep, Samuel and Eleanor sat by the fire, her hand in his, planning. Not just a wedding, but a future. How they'd tell the town, how they'd deal with Henry, how they'd build a life together from the wreckage of their individual pasts. "Are you afraid?" Samuel asked quietly. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted, "but also more certain than I've ever been. This is right. We're right. Everything else, Henry, the gossip, the challenges, we'll face it together." Samuel lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Together," he agreed, "always together." But neither of them knew that Henry Braddock, sitting in his room at the boarding house, was already writing letters. Letters that would bring Eleanor's past crashing into her present with devastating force. Letters that would test everything they'd just promised each other. The storm was coming. They just didn't know it yet. Dawn came too quickly. Eleanor woke on her makeshift bed by the fire with the weight of the coming day pressing on her chest like a physical thing. Today she would face Henry Braddock. Today she would tell him she'd chosen Samuel, chosen June, chosen this hard Montana life over everything he represented. And today, Henry would make good on his threats. She rose quietly, not wanting to wake Samuel or June, and stepped outside into the crystalline morning. The sun was just breaking over the mountains, painting the snow gold and pink. Beautiful country, honest country, worth fighting for. Couldn't sleep either? Eleanor turned to find Samuel standing in the doorway, his hair mussed, wearing only his work shirt despite the cold. He crossed to her, draping a blanket over her shoulders, and stood close enough that she could feel his warmth. I keep thinking about what Henry will do when I tell him no, she admitted, what he's capable of. Let me come with you to town. You don't have to face him alone. No. Eleanor shook her head firmly. If you're there, he'll use it as ammunition. He'll say you're controlling me, that I can't think for myself. I need to do this on my own. Show him, show everyone, that this is my choice. Samuel's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Then I'll wait here. But Eleanor, if he threatens you, if he tries anything, I'll be fine. Mrs. Henderson will be there. Half the town will be watching. Henry's too concerned with his image to do anything publicly violent. She turned to face him fully. But Samuel, you need to be prepared. After today there will be talk. Henry won't go quietly. He'll spread every rumor he can think of. Let him talk. We know the truth. The truth doesn't always matter in a small town. Perception matters. And right now the perception is that I'm a fallen woman living in sin with a widower and his child. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. I don't care what they say about me. But June, she'll hear things at school from other children. She'll be hurt because of me. Samuel cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs brushing her cheekbones. Then we get married. Today. Right now, if we could. Take away his ammunition. We can't marry today. There are legalities, arrangements. Actually, we can. Samuel's expression was determined. Montana territory allows marriage by declaration in front of witnesses. No license required, though we'd need to file papers eventually. But if we stand in front of the town and declare ourselves married, it's legal, binding. Eleanor stared at him. You're serious? Completely. We get dressed, we ride into town, we gather witnesses, and we get married. Before you even see Henry Braddock. By the time he finds out, it'll be too late. You'll be Eleanor Kane, and there won't be a damn thing he can do about it. It was reckless, impulsive, everything Eleanor had spent her life avoiding, but it was also right. She could feel the rightness of it settling into her bones. Yes, she said, let's do it. They woke June, who was predictably ecstatic, and explained the plan. The child was dressed and ready in record time, bouncing with excitement while Samuel hitched the wagon and Eleanor changed into her best dress. The deep blue wool she'd worn to Sunday dinner. Not a wedding dress. She'd worn her wedding dress once, for a marriage that never happened. This time she'd marry in ordinary clothes, in an ordinary moment that was somehow more sacred than any elaborate ceremony. The ride to town was tense with anticipation. Samuel drove with single-minded focus while June chattered about whether they'd have cake, and could she be a witness, and would Eleanor really truly be her mother now? Eleanor held Samuel's free hand, drawing strength from the solid warmth of him. They reached Bitter Creek just as the town was waking. Mrs. Henderson was on her porch, sweeping, and her eyes widened when she saw them. Eleanor, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, her voice steady. Everything's right, actually. Mrs. Henderson, we need your help, and witnesses. They explained quickly. Henry's arrival, his threats, their decision. Mrs. Henderson listened with growing satisfaction. About damn time, she said when they finished. I'll gather people. Give me 10 minutes. The church? The church, Samuel confirmed. Word spread through Bitter Creek with the speed of wildfire. By the time Samuel, Eleanor, and June reached the small church with the crooked steeple, a crowd had gathered. Mrs. Henderson was there, of course, along with Tom Brewster, who'd been helping with Samuel's chores, the shopkeeper and his wife, the livery owner, the schoolteacher, even the saloon keeper looking amused by the whole situation, and Henry Braddock standing on the church steps with a face like thunder. What's the meaning of this? He demanded as Samuel helped Eleanor down from the wagon. Eleanor, I gave you until evening to make your decision. I'm making it now. Eleanor's voice carried clearly in the cold morning air. I'm marrying Samuel Kane. Today. Right now. Henry's face went from red to purple. You can't be serious. This is insanity. You've known this man for barely a month. Long enough to know he's worth 10 of you. Eleanor stood straight, meeting Henry's furious gaze without flinching. You abandoned me, Henry. You chose money and connections over me, and you did it in the cruelest way possible. Now you want me back because your gamble didn't pay off. But I'm not a possession you can pick up and put down at your convenience. Your reputation is my own concern, not yours, not my aunt's, mine. Eleanor felt Samuel's presence at her back, solid and reassuring. And I choose to marry a good man who loves me for myself, not for what I can bring to a marriage. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a wedding to attend. She moved to walk past Henry, but he grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. You're making a mistake, Eleanor. This backwoods nobody will never give you the life you deserve. You'll be stuck on a failing ranch, raising another woman's child, growing old before your time. Is that really what you want? Samuel's hand closed around Henry's wrist, his grip iron. Let her go. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the threat of violence crackling between them. Then Tom Brewster stepped forward, along with two other men from town. I think you heard Mr. Kane, Tom said mildly. Let the lady go. Henry released Eleanor's arm, but his expression was venomous. This isn't over. I'll write to every newspaper in Virginia. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of woman you are. You'll never be able to show your face in civilized society again. Good, Eleanor said simply, because I have no intention of ever returning to your version of civilized society. Now, if you're quite finished, I have a wedding to attend. She walked up the church steps, Samuel beside her and June clinging to her other hand. Behind them, she heard Mrs. Henderson's voice, sharp as a blade. Mr. Braddock, I believe you've overstayed your welcome in Bitter Creek. I suggest you collect your things from the boarding house and catch the next train east, unless you'd like the sheriff to escort you. Eleanor didn't hear Henry's response. She was already inside the church, her heart hammering but her resolve absolute. The interior was simple. Wooden pews, a rough altar, winter light streaming through plain glass windows. Nothing like the Grand Richmond Chapel where she'd once imagined marrying Henry. Better, realer, true. The minister appeared from the vestry, a gray-haired man named Reverend Walsh who'd known Samuel and Mara. He looked surprised but not displeased as the crowd filed in. Samuel Kane, he said warmly, this is unexpected, but I can't say I'm unhappy to see it. Mara would want you to live again. Samuel's throat worked. Thank you, Reverend. They gathered at the altar, Samuel, Eleanor, and June between them. The witnesses filled the pews behind them, creating a community of support that made Eleanor's eyes burn with gratitude. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, beaming. Tom Brewster gave Samuel an encouraging nod. Reverend Walsh opened his worn Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to witness the union of Samuel Kane and Eleanor Whitfield. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Eleanor barely heard the traditional words. She was too focused on Samuel's face, on the emotion she saw there, not grief, not guilt, but genuine happiness. And hope, so much hope. Samuel, Reverend Walsh said, do you take Eleanor to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part. I do. Samuel's voice was firm, certain. I absolutely do. And Eleanor, do you take Samuel to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Eleanor looked at Samuel, this hard, honest man who'd stopped his wagon for a stranger, who'd fought his way back from grief, who'd opened his heart despite every reason not to. Then she looked at June, whose eyes were shining with tears and joy. I do, she said clearly, with all my heart. Reverend Walsh smiled. The rings? Samuel looked stricken. They'd had no time to arrange for rings, but Mrs. Henderson was already moving forward, pressing something into Samuel's palm. When he opened his hand, Eleanor saw a simple gold band. It was my mother's, Mrs. Henderson whispered. Consider it a loan until you can get your own. Samuel's eyes were suspiciously bright as he took Eleanor's hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. "With this ring, I thee wed." Reverend Walsh cleared his throat. "By the power vested in me, and in accordance with the laws of Montana Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride." Samuel cupped Eleanor's face gently, his eyes searching hers one last time, giving her one last chance to change her mind. Eleanor rose on her toes and closed the distance, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was soft, brief, and full of promise. The church erupted in applause. June threw her arms around both of them, squealing with delight. Mrs. Henderson was crying openly. Even Tom Brewster looked suspiciously emotional. Eleanor pulled back, breathless, and found Samuel looking at her with such naked adoration that her knees went weak. "Hello, husband," she whispered. "Hello, wife." Samuel's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Let's go home." But they weren't allowed to leave quite yet. Mrs. Henderson insisted on photographs. She'd brought her camera, somehow anticipating this outcome. The schoolteacher produced a registry book for them to sign. Tom Brewster pressed an envelope into Samuel's hand. A little something to help with expenses. Through it all, Eleanor kept expecting Henry to burst back in to create one final scene. But he didn't. When they finally emerged from the church into the bright morning, his horse was gone from the hitching post. He'd left, defeated and humiliated, and Eleanor felt nothing but relief. The ride back to the ranch was entirely different from the ride into town. June sat between them, chattering about how she was going to tell everyone at school that Miss Eleanor was now her mama. Samuel held Eleanor's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. She was married. Eleanor Kane now, was married to a man she'd known for barely 6 weeks. It was mad. It was reckless. It was the sanest thing she'd ever done. When they reached the ranch, Samuel lifted June down from the wagon, then turned to Eleanor. Before she could move, he swept her up into his arms. "Samuel, what are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold. It's tradition." His eyes sparkled with rare humor. "Unless you'd prefer to walk?" "Don't you dare put me down." Samuel carried her into the house with June dancing ahead, laughing at their silliness. He set Eleanor down gently in front of the fireplace, in the very spot where she'd first stood weeks ago as a frozen, desperate stranger. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kane," he said softly. Mrs. Kane. The name settled over Eleanor like a blessing. She looked around the small house, at Mara's sampler still on the wall, at June's toys scattered in the corner, at the rocking chair by the fire, and felt no anxiety, no sense of displacement. This was her home now. She would honor Mara's memory while creating her own place here. June tugged on Eleanor's skirt. "Mama? Can I call you Mama now? Since you're really my mama now?" Eleanor's breath caught. She knelt, taking June's small hands in hers. "If you want to, sweetheart, it would make me very happy." "I want to." June threw her arms around Eleanor's neck. "I love you, Mama." "I love you too, my darling girl." When Eleanor stood, she found Samuel watching them with tears streaming down his face. He didn't bother to hide them, just pulled both of them into his arms and held on tight. "Thank you," he whispered into Eleanor's hair. "Thank you for staying, for fighting, for giving us a chance." "Thank you for stopping your wagon," Eleanor replied, "for seeing me, for loving me." They stood that way for a long time, a family forged not from blood or tradition, but from choice and courage and hope. Eventually, June squirmed free, demanding lunch and declaring herself starving. Eleanor moved to the kitchen, and Samuel followed, unable to stop touching her. A hand at her waist, fingers brushing her shoulder, small constant contacts as though reassuring himself she was real. They made lunch together, a simple meal of bread and cheese and leftover stew, and ate at the small table that now felt perfectly sized for their family of 3. June chattered about what they should do to celebrate, suggesting everything from a party to a trip to town for candy. Eleanor and Samuel exchanged amused glances over her head, communicating in the wordless language of parents. After lunch, Samuel announced he needed to check on the animals, and June begged to go with him. Eleanor shooed them both out, grateful for a moment alone to process everything that had happened. She moved through the house, really looking at it for the first time as its mistress rather than a guest. She studied Mara's sampler on the wall, the carefully stitched words, "Home is where the heart lives." Eleanor had worried that Mara's presence would haunt her, that she'd always feel like an interloper in another woman's space. But standing here now, she felt only gratitude. Mara had loved this house, this man, this land. She'd built a foundation. Eleanor wasn't replacing that foundation. She was building on it. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered to the woman she'd never met, "for loving them so well, for teaching them what love looks like. I promise I'll take care of them. I promise." A gust of wind rattled the windows, and Eleanor chose to believe it was Mara's answer. Approval, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement. Either way, Eleanor felt the last knot of anxiety in her chest loosen. She was organizing the kitchen when she heard hoofbeats again. Her heart seized. Had Henry come back? But when she looked out the window, she saw Mrs. Henderson's buggy pulling up, overflowing with what appeared to be half the contents of someone's house. Eleanor opened the door as Mrs. Henderson climbed down, followed by the schoolteacher, the shopkeeper's wife, and 3 other women from town. "What's all this?" "Wedding gifts, dear." Mrs. Henderson directed the women to start unloading. "When word spread about your marriage, half the town wanted to contribute. New linens, yours looked threadbare, a proper set of dishes, some preserved food to get you through the rest of winter. And this," she pulled out a carefully wrapped bundle, "is from me." Eleanor unwrapped it to find a beautiful quilt, hand-stitched in a wedding ring pattern, the colors rich and warm. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't possibly—" "Hush! Every bride needs a wedding quilt. I've been working on it for weeks, ever since I saw the way Samuel looked at you in the general store." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were soft. "You're one of us now, Eleanor. Part of the community. We take care of our own." Eleanor's vision blurred. These women, most of whom she barely knew, had brought gifts and goodwill, welcoming her not as a scandal or a curiosity, but as one of them. A neighbor. A friend. "Thank you," she managed. "All of you. This means more than I can say." They stayed for an hour, these women of Bitter Creek, filling the house with laughter and advice and the warm chaos of female friendship. They taught Eleanor which families to avoid and which to cultivate. They shared recipes and gossip and warnings about the harsh Montana winters. They made her feel, for the first time since her parents died, like she belonged somewhere. When they finally left, the house was transformed. New curtains at the windows, fresh linens on the bed, the kitchen stocked with preserves and dried goods, evidence everywhere of a community embracing its newest member. Samuel and June returned to find Eleanor standing in the middle of it all, looking dazed. "What happened here?" Samuel asked, taking in the changes. "The town happened. They brought gifts, so many gifts." Eleanor gestured helplessly. "Mrs. Henderson organized the whole thing." Samuel shook his head, but he was smiling. "That woman is a force of nature." "She's a blessing." Eleanor turned to him. "They all are. People have never just accepted me like this before. No judgment, no questions. Just welcome. That's Bitter Creek for you. We're small and we're rough around the edges, but we take care of each other." Samuel pulled her close. "And you're one of us now." As evening fell, they established new routines as a family. Samuel read to June while Eleanor prepared dinner, a better effort than usual, bolstered by the new ingredients and her growing confidence in the kitchen. They ate together, June dominating the conversation with plans for tomorrow and the day after, and all the days stretching into their future. When it was time for bed, Eleanor helped June into her nightgown and braided her hair, tasks that already felt natural. June said her prayers, blessing Daddy and Mama, the words still sent a thrill through Eleanor, and the horses and the calf named Hope, and Mrs. Henderson and everyone else she could think of. "Mama?" June said as Eleanor tucked her in. "Are you happy you stayed?" "Happier than I've ever been in my whole life." "Me too." June yawned hugely. "I knew you'd stay. I prayed so hard, and God always answers prayers." Eleanor kissed her forehead. "Sleep well, my darling." She emerged from the bedroom to find Samuel banking the fire, moving with the careful efficiency of habit. When he saw her, he straightened, suddenly looking uncertain. I can sleep in the chair tonight, he offered. I know this has all happened fast. If you need time, Eleanor crossed to him, taking his hands. Samuel Kane, we're married. Properly married. I don't want you sleeping in a chair. Are you sure? Because I don't want you to feel pressured. She stopped his words with a kiss, longer and deeper than the one in church. When she pulled back, Samuel's eyes were dark with emotion. I'm sure, she said firmly. I chose you. I chose this life. I don't need time to know it was the right choice. Samuel kissed her again, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that made her ache. I love you, Eleanor Kane. I know I said it yesterday in the heat of the moment, but I mean it. I love you. I love you too. I think I have since you gave me your coat in the snow and told me no one should be left in the cold. They stood in the firelight holding each other, and Eleanor felt the last piece of herself click into place. This was where she was meant to be. Not in Richmond with Henry, not wandering alone, but here in this small Montana ranch house with a man who'd learned to love again and a little girl who'd chosen her as a mother. The wedding night was gentle, tentative, full of whispered words and careful touches. Samuel treated Eleanor like she was precious, fragile, something to be treasured. And Eleanor, who'd spent so much of her life feeling unwanted, felt herself unfold beneath his attention like a flower opening to sun. Afterward, lying in Samuel's arms in the darkness, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. The train west, the humiliation, the frozen platform. If someone had told her that day that she'd find happiness in Montana, married to a widowed rancher, she would have laughed bitterly. But life, she was learning, had a strange way of leading you exactly where you needed to be, even if the path looked nothing like what you'd planned. What are you thinking? Samuel's voice was drowsy, content. That I'm grateful Henry Braddock was a coward. If he'd actually married me, I would have spent my whole life with the wrong man, never knowing what I was missing. Samuel's arms tightened around her. His loss. My gain. Eleanor smiled into the darkness. Our gain. All of ours. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Eleanor threw herself into making the house truly hers, rearranging furniture, adding her own touches while honoring Mara's memory. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, when to feed the chickens, how to milk the cow, the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and mending that kept a household running. She discovered she had a talent for the account books, just as she had with Mrs. Henderson's ledgers. Under her management, the ranch's finances became organized, efficient. She identified waste, negotiated better prices with suppliers in town, and within a month had saved enough that Samuel could afford to buy 2 more head of cattle. You're better at this than I ever was, he admitted one evening, watching her work. Mara tried to teach me proper bookkeeping, but I never had the head for it. Eleanor looked up from the ledger. Mara did the books? She did everything. Cooking, cleaning, accounts, animal care. She was... Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. She was remarkable, and I know I'll never stop missing her. But Eleanor, I need you to understand, what I feel for you isn't less because I still love her. It's just different, both real, both true. I know. And Eleanor did know. She'd stopped feeling threatened by Mara's memory. Instead, she felt a strange kinship with the woman. 2 people who'd loved the same man, the same child, the same hard land. Love isn't finite. There's room for all of it. Samuel crossed to her, tilting her face up to kiss her softly. When did you get so wise? When I married you and inherited your wisdom by proxy. He laughed, a sound that was becoming more common in the house. June heard it from where she was playing with her dolls and looked up with a grin. Daddy's laughing again, she announced to her dolls. Mama makes him laugh. It's nice. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and turning the ranch into a sea of mud. Eleanor planted a garden with June's help, teaching the child about seeds and growth and patience. They worked side by side in the dirt, and Eleanor felt herself putting down roots as surely as the seeds they planted. Word came from Virginia, a terse letter from Aunt Letitia disowning Eleanor completely. Eleanor read it once, then burned it in the fire without a second thought. That life was behind her. She was Eleanor Kane now, wife and mother and Montana rancher. The Richmond debutante might as well have never existed. Henry Braddock, they heard through town gossip, had returned to Virginia in disgrace. His brief marriage to Catherine Wardwell had ended in scandal, something about gambling debts and accusations of fraud. Eleanor felt nothing when she heard. Henry belonged to a different lifetime, and this life, her real life, had no room for him. Summer brought long days of hard work. Samuel taught Eleanor to ride properly, not just side saddle, but astride like a practical ranch woman. She learned to rope a calf, mend a fence, doctor a sick horse. Her hands grew calloused, her skin tanned, her body strong from constant labor. She barely recognized the pale, fragile woman who'd stepped off the train in her wedding dress. One warm July evening, Eleanor was washing dishes while Samuel read to June and played with the child's hair. He'd finally mastered braiding when June made an announcement. "We should plant a tree for Mama Mara." Eleanor's hand stilled in the dishwater. Samuel looked up from the book, surprise and something like pain crossing his face. "What made you think of that, little one?" "Because she's part of our family. Even though she's in heaven, she's still here, and Mama Eleanor is part of our family, and we're all together, and we should have something that shows that, a tree that will grow and be here forever." June looked between her parents with solemn certainty. "That's what families do. They grow together." Eleanor met Samuel's eyes across the room. She saw him struggling with emotion, with the beautiful simplicity of their daughter's wisdom. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. We'll plant a tree. All three of us together." They chose an aspen sapling from the creek bed, slender and graceful. They planted it on the hill behind the house, where it would grow tall and strong and visible for miles. June said a prayer, her small voice carrying in the summer wind. Samuel spoke briefly about Mara, about the love they'd shared and the daughter she'd given him. And Eleanor simply stood with her hand on the small trunk and whispered a promise to honor the past while building the future. As they walked back to the house, June between them holding both their hands, Eleanor felt the last shadow lift from her heart. This was her family, not despite the ghosts, but because of them. Mara would always be part of their story, and that was right and good. By autumn, Eleanor was pregnant. She told Samuel on a cool September evening, watching him carefully for his reaction. She saw joy, but also fear, memories of what pregnancy had cost him before. "I'm scared," he admitted, pulling her close. "I almost lost everything when I can't go through that again." "You won't," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm strong. I'm healthy. And we're going to be fine. All of us." June was ecstatic at the prospect of a baby brother or sister, immediately making plans for names and sleeping arrangements, and who would teach the baby important skills like feeding chickens and braiding hair. The pregnancy was smooth, uneventful, everything Mara's had not been. Eleanor worked almost until the day her labor started, refusing to be coddled despite Samuel's constant worrying. When her time came, Mrs. Henderson and the doctor attended while Samuel paced outside with June, both of them terrified despite all of Eleanor's reassurances. The birth was hard, but not dangerous. And when Eleanor heard her daughter's first cry, saw Samuel's face as he held the tiny, perfect baby, she knew that every moment of struggle had been worth it. They named her Hope Mara Kane. Hope for the future they were building. Mara in honor of the woman who'd come before. June cried when she heard the name, touched beyond words that her first mother was being honored in this way. "She would have loved this," June whispered, holding her baby sister with careful reverence. "Mama Mara would have loved that there's another baby in the house, and that we're all together." That first Christmas as a complete family was magical. Eleanor had learned to bake proper bread, and the house smelled of cinnamon and pine. June helped decorate with chains made from dried berries and paper. Samuel brought in a small tree, and they hung it with candles and simple ornaments. Baby Hope slept in a cradle by the fire, occasionally waking to nurse or be rocked. On Christmas Eve, they sat together by the fire, Samuel, Eleanor, June, and Hope. June read the Christmas story from the family Bible, her voice clear and confident. Samuel held Eleanor's hand, his other arm around June's shoulders. Baby Hope made soft sleeping sounds. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked Eleanor quietly, under June's reading. Eleanor looked around the small, warm house, at the tree glowing with candlelight. at June reading with such concentration, at the baby she'd carried safely into the world, at the man who'd stopped his wagon for a stranger and changed both their lives forever. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she said. "This, right here, this is everything I didn't know I wanted." Samuel kissed her temple. "Thank you for saying yes, in the snow, in the barn, at the church. Thank you for all the times you said yes when it would have been easier to say no. Thank you for asking, for seeing me, for loving me enough to fight for us." June finished the reading and closed the Bible. That was good. Baby Jesus and his family, all safe and together. Just like us. Just like us, Eleanor agreed. She looked at the sampler on the wall, Mara's careful stitching, the words that had once intimidated her. Home is where the heart lives. This was home. Not because of the building or the land, but because of the hearts that lived here. 4 hearts, bound together by love and choice, and the determination to keep choosing each other day after day. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ranch in white silence. Inside, the fire crackled and the candles glowed, and a family that had been born from loss and grief and hope huddled close, celebrating not just Christmas, but the everyday miracle of being together. Eleanor Kane, who'd come west in a wedding dress she'd sewn by candlelight, who'd been abandoned on a frozen train platform, who'd nearly frozen to death before a hard, grieving rancher stopped his wagon and changed her life forever. That Eleanor was gone. In her place was this Eleanor, strong and capable and deeply, fiercely loved. She glanced out the window at the aspen tree they'd planted on the hill. Even in winter, it stood proud and straight, its white bark glowing in the moonlight. Come spring, it would leaf out, providing shade and beauty. It would grow for years, decades, perhaps centuries. A living reminder that families weren't just born, they were built, one careful choice at a time. "Time for bed," Eleanor said eventually. June protested half-heartedly, but was clearly exhausted from the day's excitement. Samuel carried her to her room while Eleanor checked on Hope one more time, marveling as always at the tiny perfection of her daughter. Later, lying in bed with Samuel's arm around her and moonlight painting silver patterns on the walls, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. The train west, the crushing disappointment, the moment when death had seemed preferable to facing an uncertain future. If she could go back to that frozen platform and tell that desperate, heartbroken woman what waited for her, would she believe it? Would she have had the courage to hold on if she'd known? "What are you thinking about?" Samuel's voice rumbled against her ear where her head rested on his chest. "About that first night, when you stopped your wagon and June said I looked like Mara. Were you angry that she made you stop?" "Furious," Samuel admitted. "Not at her, at fate, or God, or whatever force had put you there in that moment. Because I knew, even then I knew, that stopping would change everything. That I wouldn't be able to just drive away. But you stopped anyway." "I stopped anyway. June said you looked like Mara, and I couldn't—" He paused, choosing his words. "Mara made me promise, at the end, promise that I wouldn't let grief destroy me, that I'd stay human, stay kind, stay open to living. I'd broken that promise every day for 2 years, but that night when I saw you standing there in that wedding dress, I heard her voice in my head, and I stopped." Eleanor tilted her head to look at him. "Do you think she knew, somehow, that stopping for me would save you as much as it saved me? I don't know, maybe. Or maybe love, real love, doesn't die when the person dies. Maybe it just changes form, becomes something that guides us forward instead of holding us back." They fell silent, holding each other in the darkness. Outside, the wind sang through the pine trees. The aspen on the hill swayed gently. The ranch that had been a place of grief was now a place of healing, of growth, of new beginnings built on the foundation of old love. Morning would come soon enough, bringing its routines of feeding animals and tending children and all the small, essential tasks that made up a life. But for now, in this quiet moment, Eleanor simply existed in the peace of being exactly where she was meant to be. She thought about the pink ribbon June had given her that first week. Mara's ribbon, faded and precious. Eleanor had kept it tucked away in her drawer, a tangible connection to the woman she'd never met but who'd shaped so much of her life. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd give it to June. Pass it down, the way mothers pass down memories and love and legacy. "Samuel?" she whispered, not sure if he was still awake. "Hmm? I'm glad you stopped. I'm glad June saw me. I'm glad for all of it, even the painful parts, because it brought me here, to you, to this life." Samuel's arms tightened around her. "Me too, love. Me too." Eleanor closed her eyes, safe and warm and home. The abandoned bride, the woman left in the snow, had died that December night at Bitter Creek Station. In her place had been born Eleanor Kane, wife, mother, survivor, fighter. A woman who'd chosen love over fear, hope over despair, and built something beautiful from the ruins of her broken dreams. And as sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor smiled, knowing that when morning came, she'd wake up to more of this life, more of this love, more mornings with Samuel and June and hope, building their future one day at a time. Outside, the snow stopped falling. The moon climbed higher, painting the Montana landscape in silver and shadow. The aspen trees stood watch on the hill. And in the small ranch house where grief had once lived alone, a family slept peacefully, bound together by the kind of love that doesn't just survive tragedy. It transforms it into triumph. The end.